Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets comfortable and science settles in for the evening. Tonight we're spending a little time with a molecule so small and so ordinary sounding that it rarely gets invited into everyday conversation, and yet it quietly shapes nearly every day of your life. Its name is adenosine, and if you have ever wondered why your eyes grow heavy, why your thinking gets softer around the edges, or why a chair becomes suspiciously attractive in the late afternoon, this gentle little chemical has a great deal to do with it. It is, in its own understated way, one of the reasons you get tired at all. Before we get into that, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the day or night. It feels fitting, really, because tiredness always seems to arrive with such personal timing. For one person, it appears after lunch like an uninvited but predictable guest. For another, it waits until midnight and then suddenly drapes itself over the shoulders all at once. And for some unlucky souls, it turns up at 10 in the morning during a meeting that could have been an email. If you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a nice place to let your thoughts slow down for a while, I'd be very grateful if you liked the video and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this sleepy little corner of science find other people who may need a calm voice and a quieter ending to the day. Now then, get comfortable, let your breathing settle, and let's begin with one of the strangest and most familiar experiences in human life, the very ordinary mystery of becoming tired. It happens so often that we almost stop noticing how odd it is. You wake up, perhaps a little reluctantly, perhaps with a noble plan to become the sort of person who greets the morning with grace and lemon water. Then the day begins. You move, think, speak, read, decide, remember, respond, and slowly, without much ceremony, something changes. Your sharpness fades a little, your patience becomes more fragile, your body starts bargaining with furniture. A sofa looks less like an object and more like a life partner. By evening, the world has not necessarily grown louder or harder, but you have become less able to keep pace with it. And somewhere in the background, beyond your awareness, adenosine has been quietly accumulating. That is one of the first useful things to understand about tiredness. It is not just a dramatic feeling your brain invents for amusement, though there are certainly days when it feels personal. Tiredness is a signal. More specifically, part of what you feel as sleepiness comes from a pressure that builds while you're awake. The longer you stay up, the more that pressure rises. The brain keeps a kind of running account of wakefulness, and adenosine is deeply involved in that accounting. It is not the only thing that matters, and we will get to those other pieces in time, but it is one of the central players. If your daily rhythm is a long conversation between wakefulness and rest, adenosine is one of the quiet voices that gradually leans in and says, with increasing confidence, I think that will do for now. What makes this especially interesting is that adenosine is not some rare substance your body produces only for sleep. It is not an emergency flare shot into the sky each evening. It is part of normal biology, woven into the busy, ordinary fact of being alive. Your cells use energy constantly. Every thought, every muscle movement, every tiny act of cellular housekeeping has a cost. Life is active. Even when you're sitting still, the body is doing an astonishing amount of work. Your brain, in particular, is expensive. It may not look like much from the outside, just a thoughtful lump with opinions, memories, and occasional nonsense, but it consumes an extraordinary amount of energy for its size. Keeping billions of neurons ready to fire, reset, and communicate is no small task. And as that work goes on, adenosine becomes part of the story. Now, before this starts to sound as though your brain is some weary office building slowly filling with paperwork, which to be fair is not the worst metaphor, it helps to keep the everyday feeling in view. Sleepiness has texture. It is not simply, I want sleep in the abstract. It is slower reactions. It is rereading the same sentence and realizing none of it stayed in place. It is forgetting why you walked into a room, then staring nobly at a lamp as if the lamp might help. It is finding that your jokes are either much worse or much funnier than usual, sometimes both. It is your body and brain becoming less interested in the ambitious business of wakefulness. And that shift does not happen by magic. One of the odd little comforts of biology is that many things we experience as weakness or inconvenience are actually signs that the body is doing exactly what it should. Hunger can be annoying, but it tells a useful truth. Pain is unpleasant, but it protects. Fever is miserable, yet often purposeful. Tiredness belongs in that category too. It can be inconvenient, especially when it arrives at the wrong hour, but it is not a design flaw, it is a protective message. Adenosine helps deliver that message by building up as wakefulness continues, nudging the brain away from endless activity and toward the restoration that sleep provides. In that sense, sleepiness is less like betrayal and more like guidance, even if it does tend to appear while you're trying to finish something important. And that is perhaps why modern life has such a strained relationship with tiredness. We treat it as an obstacle to overcome, a technical error to be patched, a personal failure to be hidden behind brighter lights and stronger coffee. We speak of pushing through, powering on, squeezing more out of the day as though the body were a machine that merely needs better management. But the body is not trying to sabotage your ambitions. It is trying to keep you within the boundaries of what a human nervous system can sustain. Adenosine does not build up because your brain is lazy. It builds up because your brain has been working. Think for a moment about the structure of an ordinary day. Early on, for many people at least, there is a sense of available energy. The mind feels clearer. Decisions are easier. The world seems negotiable. But as hours pass, attention becomes more costly. Small problems feel larger. Patience runs low. By late evening, the same person who cheerfully planned a productive night may find themselves staring into the middle distance while holding a spoon for no obvious reason. There are many layers behind that change, including the circadian rhythm that helps time alertness and sleep. But adenosine is part of what makes prolonged wakefulness feel increasingly heavy. It is one reason why being awake for 16 hours feels different from being awake for 6. Children often offer a particularly vivid example of this, though they would rarely appreciate being used for science in the moment. A tired child can become theatrical in ways that seem to defy logic. There are tears over biscuits, strange bursts of energy, profound objections to bath water, and philosophical crises involving socks. Adults are not actually so different. We simply tend to hide it under emails and slightly haunted facial expressions. Fatigue changes behaviour. It makes emotions less regulated, thoughts less tidy, and effort more expensive. Underneath all that, the brain is responding to biological signals that have been accumulating since the moment waking began. There is also something oddly democratic about tiredness. It comes for everyone. Professors, surgeons, bus drivers, poets, accountants, athletes, kings, insomniacs, and the one person in every office who insists they only need 4 hours of sleep and seems somehow alarmingly cheerful about it. No one lives outside the physics and chemistry of wakefulness. Even those who resist it spectacularly are still negotiating with the same fundamental processes. Adenosine is not impressed by confidence. It does not care how many tabs you have open, how important your plans are, or whether you have told yourself that tonight is the night you finally reorganize the kitchen drawer that contains batteries, string, and one key nobody recognizes. It keeps building. It keeps signaling. It keeps reminding the brain that wakefulness has a cost. That cost is not purely mental either. Tiredness can feel like it lives in the whole body. Limbs grow heavier, muscles become less willing, posture slackens. Even the eyes themselves seem to participate in the protest. There is a reason people say their eyelids feel heavy. Fatigue affects movement, coordination, and the general willingness of the body to keep performing energetic tasks. The brain is central in this, of course, but it never works in isolation. A human being is not a brain dragging around a body like inconvenient luggage. The systems are deeply connected, and when the drive for sleep rises, the whole person begins to shift. Now, one might reasonably ask why evolution would arrange things this way. Why create a creature capable of language, invention, music, engineering, and late-night regret, only to require that creature to become unconscious for a large chunk of every day. It seems on the surface quite inefficient. Surely there might have been a better design, perhaps one with discrete charging ports or a polite notification at 10% battery. But sleep is not a flaw in the system. It is part of the system. Brains need periods of reduced outward engagement in order to do other essential work. Memory processing, cellular maintenance, metabolic clearance, emotional recalibration, and many other processes are linked to sleep. Adenosine helps make sure that wakefulness does not extend indefinitely at the expense of those needs. It is one of the means by which the body insists on balance. There is a gentle irony here. Many of the things we most admire in ourselves, focus, creativity, persistence, problem-solving, all depend on a brain that is allowed to rest. Yet the very state that protects those abilities is often treated as optional. We praise the all-nighter and mock the early bedtime. We act as though needing sleep were faintly embarrassing, as though a body that asks for recovery is being melodramatic. But biology is not sentimental, and it is not especially interested in cultural posturing. If wakefulness continues, the pressure for sleep rises. If recovery is delayed, performance slips. You may win a brief argument with your body, but it has the stronger paperwork. This is where adenosine becomes such a fascinating subject for a sleep-friendly bit of science, because it lives at the meeting point between chemistry and feeling. It is one thing to say that people get tired. Everyone knows that. It is another to see that this tiredness is not vague or mysterious in the hand-waving sense. It is embodied. It has mechanisms. There are molecules involved, receptors involved, neural systems involved. Something as personal and familiar as drowsiness is, at least in part, a biochemical negotiation, unfolding moment by moment inside the brain. That does not make the experience less human. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. The softness behind your eyes at the end of the day is connected to molecular events so small, you will never feel them directly, and yet together they shape the whole contour of your evening. It is also worth noticing that tiredness does not always arrive in a straight line. Sometimes it creeps in gently. Sometimes it seems absent until, all at once, you discover you have become incapable of basic arithmetic and emotionally attached to a blanket. There are moments in the day when alertness returns unexpectedly, and others when it vanishes without warning. This is because sleepiness is not governed by a single switch. Adenosine is important, but it works alongside other systems, especially the body's circadian timing. One process tracks how long you have been awake. Another helps decide when sleep tends to occur. When those processes line up, the desire for sleep can feel very strong indeed. When they pull in different directions, things get more complicated. That complicated dance is part of why you can sometimes feel strangely awake late at night and impossibly tired at 3 in the afternoon. Still, for all that complexity, there is something almost reassuring in knowing that the sensation of tiredness has structure. On difficult days, fatigue can feel like a moral judgment, as though your body is accusing you of poor character. But adenosine is not making moral claims. It is not calling you lazy, weak, or insufficiently disciplined. It is signaling that time awake has consequences. That is a very different message. It replaces blame with biology. It suggests that the heavy mind and drooping focus of evening are not failures of will, but ordinary features of a nervous system that has been active for hours. And perhaps that is why this topic feels so well suited to a calm evening conversation. There is something kind about learning that tiredness has a reason. Behind the foggy thinking, the yawns, the odd impulse to sit down, just for a second, and then become one with the furniture, there is a process unfolding with patient consistency. Your body has not lost interest in you. It is caring for you in the blunt but sensible language of chemistry. Adenosine rises. Wakefulness becomes harder to maintain. Sleep begins to seem not only appealing but necessary. And if you have ever wondered why caffeine feels like such a dramatic intervention, well, that too has everything to do with adenosine, though the story there is a little sneakier than it first appears. We will get to that because it is one of the most entertaining small dramas in biology. For now, though, it is enough to sit with this opening truth. Every waking hour leaves a trace. Each moment of thought and action contributes to a growing pressure that is meant to guide you toward rest. Sleepiness is not random. It is built. It accumulates. It speaks more clearly the longer it is ignored. And adenosine is one of the quiet molecules helping to carry that message through the busy landscape of your brain. So as the evening deepens, or the morning softens, or whenever this finds you, it may be worth thinking of tiredness a little differently. Not as the simple absence of energy, and not merely as inconvenience, but as information. A signal shaped by the very work of being awake. A reminder that attention is costly, that brains are hungry engines, and that rest is not some indulgence added onto life after the important things are done. It is one of the important things. And once you start seeing tiredness that way, the question begins to shift. We stop asking only why we feel sleepy, and start asking what exactly that sleepy feeling is made of, how it builds during the day, why it changes the texture of thought, and what your brain is really trying to tell you when it starts lowering the lights from within. By the time your eyes begin to feel heavy, quite a lot has already happened. The sensation itself seems simple enough. You blink more slowly, reading takes more effort, your thoughts no longer line up with the same neatness they had earlier. A chair, a bed, or even an unreasonably flat sofa starts to look like excellent life advice. But that feeling we casually call tiredness is not one single thing. It is not just low energy, and it is not simply the body running out of fuel in the way a torch runs down its batteries. It is a layered state, built from signals, chemistry, attention, timing, and the brain's growing reluctance to keep doing the very expensive work of staying awake. That is one of the first useful distinctions to make. People often use words like tired, sleepy, fatigued, drained, exhausted, and worn out as though they all mean the same thing. In everyday life, that is perfectly reasonable. If you say you are tired, no one is likely to demand a chart, but biologically these experiences overlap without being identical. Sleepiness is the pull towards sleep itself. Fatigue can include physical weariness, low motivation, or the sense that effort has become unusually costly. Mental exhaustion is the fraying of focus, clarity, and patience after too much thinking, choosing, remembering, or pretending to enjoy a group conversation that should have ended 40 minutes ago. All of these can arrive together, and very often they do, but they are not quite the same under the surface. When most people talk about heavy eyes, they are describing the most familiar face of sleepiness. There is something distinctly physical about it. The eyes sting a little, or blur, or seem less interested in remaining open than they were an hour ago. Blinking becomes longer. The muscles around the eyes feel less responsive, as though they too are beginning to negotiate the terms of the evening. This is not just poetic language. Sleepiness has bodily expression. The face softens, the head may dip. Posture becomes less committed to its earlier promises. Movements grow less precise. The body starts behaving like a place where wakefulness is becoming harder to maintain. And yet the eyes are only the most visible part of a much broader shift. Tiredness changes the whole texture of consciousness. Earlier in the day, thoughts may come quickly and arrange themselves with relatively little effort. You notice things easily. You can hold several ideas in mind. You can begin one task, pause it, return to it, and still remember what kind of creature you were when you started. But later, as tiredness builds, the mind becomes less agile. Working memory shrinks. Small decisions begin to feel strangely expensive. A sentence may need to be read twice, then 3 times, and still leave behind only the faint impression that it involved verbs. Even emotions become a little less stable. Irritation rises more quickly, patience shortens, problems feel bigger, mild inconvenience starts dressing itself as tragedy. This is why tiredness can be such an odd experience. It does not merely reduce energy in some abstract sense, it changes what it feels like to be a person for a while. The world itself seems altered, though of course it is not. What changes is your ability to meet it. A task that looked easy at noon can feel unreasonable by midnight. A minor social obligation becomes a mountain. A simple email begins to radiate historical importance. The tired brain is not just slower, it is working under different conditions. Part of the reason we misunderstand tiredness is that it is so common. Anything that happens every day becomes easy to take for granted. We're far more likely to marvel at fireworks than at breathing, which is unfortunate because breathing is doing excellent work. Tiredness belongs to that category of everyday miracles and annoyances, the regular background events that feel too familiar to deserve much thought. But if you step back from it for a moment, it is actually rather strange. A person can be fully awake, capable, focused and talkative at one point in the day, then gradually shift into a state where staying conscious during a documentary about medieval farming feels like a heroic act. That transformation is not accidental, it is regulated. There are two broad forces that shape this feeling. One is the amount of time you've been awake. The other is the time of day according to your internal clock. These systems work together, though not always politely. The first is often called sleep pressure. The longer you stay awake, the more the need for sleep builds. The second is your circadian rhythm, the internal timing system that helps determine when your body tends to feel more alert and when it becomes more ready for sleep. Sleepiness often feels strongest when both are pointing in the same direction. When you have been awake for many hours and your internal clock is also preparing the body for night, when they are out of sync, things get stranger. You can be very tired and somehow still alert, or not especially sleepy, even though you have made several choices that strongly suggest bed would be wise. That is why tiredness is not simply the same as spending energy. After all, you can feel mentally dull even after a day of sitting still, and surprisingly wakeful after physical exercise depending on timing, light exposure, stress, and countless other factors. The experience is more like a negotiated state than a simple depletion. The brain is constantly weighing signals about how long you have been awake, what time it is biologically, how stimulating the environment is, whether something important is happening, whether danger might be present, whether caffeine has arrived to complicate matters, and whether you are, despite all evidence, attempting to do paperwork at 1 a.m. That last part matters more than it may seem. Sleepiness can be masked for a time. Excitement, stress, novelty, bright light, social stimulation, and urgency can all push wakefulness upward temporarily. This is why people sometimes say they were exhausted until they started talking to friends, or falling asleep until they opened a laptop and accidentally taught their brain the dangerous lesson that midnight is a fine time to reorganize their entire life. The feeling of tiredness is real, but it is not the same as a simple on-off switch. It can be softened, delayed, amplified, or briefly hidden depending on what else is going on in the nervous system. Still, hidden is not the same as gone. One of the most dependable truths about tiredness is that postponing it is not the same as resolving it. A second wind is famous precisely because it feels so convincing. You think you are sleepy, and then suddenly you are not. The mind sharpens a little. Energy seems to return. Plans are made. Laundry is folded with optimism. But often this is not true restoration. It is a temporary shift in arousal, a change in the balance of signals. The underlying need for sleep may still be there, waiting patiently beneath the performance. Biology is often kind enough to let us bargain, but rarely so kind as to cancel the debt. When we describe tiredness from the inside, the language becomes surprisingly rich. People say their brain is foggy, their eyes are gritty, their body feels heavy, their thoughts are slow, their battery is empty, their soul has left the building, or their last functioning neuron is applying for leave. These phrases are humorous because they capture something real. Tiredness is both mental and physical, both cognitive and emotional. It affects attention, memory, reaction time, coordination, decision-making, mood, and even the way time itself seems to pass. A rested hour and a tired hour are not experienced the same way. In one, thought moves freely. In the other, even the clock appears to be giving you a tired look. There is also a social side to tiredness, though we do not always speak of it directly. A sleepy person is harder to be. Social cues become more effortful. Conversation requires more active management. The little adjustments that smooth human interaction, timing, tone, patience, listening, become harder to perform. It is why tired children melt down, tired adults snap over nothing, and tired groups become a sort of accidental experiment in the limits of civilization. Sleepiness makes the brain less flexible. It narrows tolerance. It reduces the willingness to do the extra work that kindness, humour, and careful thought often require. That narrowing is an important clue. When the brain becomes tired, it does not fail all at once. It begins to protect itself by reducing the quality of higher functions first. Attention wanders, impulse control weakens, emotional regulation becomes less steady, precision slips. It is almost as if the nervous system begins quietly shutting some of the more expensive doors in the building, while leaving the lights on in the hallway. You can still function, often surprisingly well for a while, but the quality of that functioning changes. This is one reason sleep deprivation is so deceptive. You may still feel capable of doing a task, especially a familiar one, long after your performance has measurably declined. The tired brain is not always the best judge of how tired it is. And that makes sense if you think about it. A system that is itself becoming less reliable is being asked to assess its own reliability. It is a bit like asking a very sleepy person to declare with confidence whether they are a little sleepy or extremely sleepy. The answer may not be scientifically robust. People adapt subjectively to tiredness faster than they recover objectively from it. In plain terms, you can get used to feeling bad at a certain level and stop noticing how compromised you are. That is one reason chronic insufficient sleep is so common. People begin to treat a reduced version of alertness as normal. They live inside a smaller, foggier range of functioning and assume that is simply adulthood. But tiredness is not meant to be a permanent climate. It is a signal that conditions are changing and that the body is moving toward a different state. In that sense, the feeling behind heavy eyes is not random discomfort. It is communication. The body does not send it because it is bored of your plans. It sends it because wakefulness is metabolically costly and cannot be sustained indefinitely without consequence. The brain needs intervals of sleep for maintenance, recalibration, and cleanup. Tiredness is one of the ways it guides you there. This is where it becomes useful to distinguish feeling sleepy from simply lacking enthusiasm. The two can look similar from across a room, but they are not identical. A person may be uninterested, low in motivation, or emotionally flat for reasons that have little to do with sleep pressure. But true sleepiness has a distinct biological gravity. It pulls downward. It makes wakefulness harder to hold. It shows up in slower blinks, reduced vigilance, drifting attention, and the strange way a still moment can suddenly become dangerous if you are sitting somewhere soft. Anyone who has ever tried to stay awake in a warm room with dim lighting and a long presentation full of bullet points has met this force directly. Warmth, in fact, is one of tiredness's favourite accomplices. A cool environment can support alertness, but warmth often encourages the body to let go. Darkness does the same. Quiet rhythm, low stimulation, and comfort all tilt the system toward rest. None of this causes tiredness from nowhere, but it reveals it beautifully. Sleepiness often hides behind activity and light, then becomes obvious the moment conditions stop helping you fight it. It is not unlike a person insisting they are perfectly fine until they sit down, at which point every cell in their body submits a formal request for horizontal arrangements. There is something slightly comic in the fact that the body can perform feats of extraordinary complexity: immune defense, hormonal regulation, thermal balance, sensory integration, memory consolidation, and then still communicate its need for sleep by making you stare blankly at a teaspoon. But perhaps that is fitting. Biology is elegant in mechanism and ridiculous in appearance. Much of what keeps us alive does not look glamorous from the outside. It looks like blinking, yawning, slouching, and briefly forgetting why you opened the fridge. Yawning deserves a mention here, not because it fully explains tiredness, but because it is one of its most public ambassadors. We still do not understand every detail of why humans yawn, though several theories exist involving arousal, temperature regulation, and state changes in the brain. What matters for our purposes is that yawning often appears at the edge between states, especially as sleepiness increases. It is one of the small rituals by which the body signals transition. You do not usually yawn because you have solved a tax problem with such brilliance that your system must applaud. You yawn because the balance of wakefulness is shifting, and that shift can be gradual or abrupt. There are evenings when sleepiness arrives like dusk, so slowly that you only notice it once the room is already dim. There are others when it falls like a curtain. 1 minute you're reading, the next you're reading the same sentence for the 5th time with the eerie sense that language has become overly ambitious. This variation depends on many factors, including prior sleep, circadian timing, stress, activity, and chemical signals that have been building all day. But whatever the pattern, the underlying meaning is the same. The brain is becoming less willing to sustain full alertness. The heavy eyes themselves are such a useful symbol because they sit at the border between the inner and outer experience of tiredness. Other people can see them. You can feel them. They are both sign and sensation. Yet what they represent goes far deeper than the eyelids. They are the visible edge of a changing brain state. Beneath them, networks involved in attention, alertness, memory, and sensory processing are shifting. Wake-promoting systems are losing ground. Sleep-promoting forces are gaining influence. The balance is changing minute by minute. One of the most compassionate things science can offer here is the reminder that tiredness is not laziness wearing a lab coat. It is not moral weakness. It is not evidence that you lack discipline or seriousness. Yes, there are habits that worsen it and routines that improve it, and those matter. But the fundamental feeling itself is part of healthy regulation. If you are sleepy at the end of a long day, that is not failure, it is information. It means your nervous system has been awake, active, and engaged for long enough that rest is beginning to take priority. That may sound obvious, but people are surprisingly skilled at feeling guilty for being human. They are tired and assume they should not be. They need rest and interpret it as inadequacy. They compare themselves to imaginary adults who drink water, answer emails promptly, sleep 7.5 hours with elegant consistency, and never find themselves staring at a wall because their brain has entered low power mode. This imaginary person is, of course, either fictional or heavily caffeinated. Real human beings cycle between alertness and fatigue. They become slower, softer, and less capable as wakefulness continues. That is not a personal defect. That is the contract. And within that contract, one molecule will soon deserve more of our attention than it usually gets. Because while tiredness is broader than any single chemical, adenosine is one of the clearest explanations for why wakefulness grows heavier the longer it lasts. It helps translate the cost of being awake into the feeling that rest is no longer optional. It is part of why the eyes grow heavy instead of merely decorative. It is part of why the mind begins to dim instead of simply complaining. And once you understand that, the sensation of tiredness starts to feel less like a vague inconvenience, and more like a meaningful signal, quietly built throughout the day, waiting for the brain to listen. So when that heaviness comes, as it always does, it may be worth noticing it with a little more curiosity and a little less suspicion. What you feel behind the eyes is not just the end of energy, it is the beginning of a change in state, a shift in priorities, a carefully regulated easing away from outward effort and toward the kind of rest the brain has been preparing for all along. And just beneath that familiar feeling is the next part of the story, where ordinary wakefulness, hour by hour, leaves behind exactly the kind of chemical trace that can turn a busy mind into one that finally begins to yield. By now, the sleepy feeling has a little more shape to it. It is no longer just a vague heaviness or an inconvenience that arrives in the evening and disrupts your grand plans to become mysteriously productive after 10 p.m. We have started to see that tiredness is part of a regulated process, a state the brain moves toward for reasons of its own. And sitting very near the centre of that process is adenosine, one of those quiet little molecules that sounds far too modest for the amount of influence it has over your day. If tiredness feels like a dimmer switch slowly turning down the brightness of wakefulness, adenosine is one of the hands on the dial. Not the only one, but an important one. It helps create what scientists often call sleep pressure, the steadily rising biological push towards sleep that builds the longer you stay awake. This is sometimes called homeostatic sleep pressure, which sounds a bit like an appliance manual, but the idea itself is simple. The longer you are awake, the more the need for sleep increases. Stay up for 16 hours, and sleep tends to feel more necessary than it did after 6. Stay up all night, and your brain begins filing strongly worded complaints. What makes adenosine so interesting is that it links this growing pressure to something very basic and unavoidable: the fact that being awake takes work. Wakefulness is not a neutral state. It is active, costly, and busy at the cellular level. Even when you look still from the outside, your brain is doing an extraordinary amount behind the scenes. Neurons are firing, signals are moving, ions are being shuffled in and out across cell membranes. Circuits of attention, memory, sensation, planning, emotion, and movement are all humming along, sometimes elegantly, sometimes like a committee that has misplaced the agenda. All of that activity requires energy, and in biology, energy has a very important currency called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ATP is often described as the energy currency of the cell because it stores and transfers energy in a form cells can use quickly. Whenever a cell needs to do something active, move materials, maintain gradients, build molecules, send signals, it draws on ATP. That includes brain cells, which are famously energetic little creatures. Your brain, though only a small percentage of your body weight, uses a striking share of your total energy. It is, metabolically speaking, quite an expensive organ to keep entertained. Now, here is where adenosine enters the picture in a very practical way. ATP contains adenosine as part of its structure. As energy is used and ATP is broken down and recycled through normal metabolism, adenosine-related compounds are constantly part of the process. Over the course of wakefulness, adenosine levels in and around brain tissue rise. The exact details are wonderfully complex, involving cellular metabolism, neuronal activity, support cells called astrocytes, and the broader chemistry of energy turnover, but the functional result is the important part. The more the brain spends the day being awake and active, the more adenosine signaling builds, and as that signaling rises, the pressure to sleep becomes stronger. In other words, tiredness is not arriving out of nowhere. Wakefulness is slowly helping to create it. That may sound a bit unfair at first, as though the brain sets a trap for itself simply by doing its job. But it makes more sense when you think of adenosine less as sabotage and more as bookkeeping. The brain needs a way to track the cost of ongoing activity and to translate that cost into a meaningful signal. Otherwise, wakefulness might continue far beyond what is healthy or sustainable. Adenosine helps tell the truth about how long the brain has been working. It is part of the record of time spent awake. This is also why sleep pressure feels gradual rather than theatrical. Most of the time, you do not wake up feeling fully alert and then, 3 hours later, collapse face first into a pillow because one dramatic molecule pulled a lever. What usually happens is subtler. Through the day, adenosine slowly accumulates, and the brain slowly becomes more receptive to rest. Attention becomes slightly harder to hold. Effort feels a little more expensive. If the day goes on long enough, these little shifts become more obvious. By late evening or in the small hours after a poor night of sleep, the accumulated pressure can be unmistakable. There is something rather elegant about this arrangement. The body does not simply wait for exhaustion and then panic. It builds a rising signal in proportion to wakefulness. That allows sleep need to have texture and timing. You can feel the difference between being awake for 4 hours and 14. You can tell when you have had enough, even if you insist on arguing with yourself about it. Adenosine helps make that difference legible. Of course, the experience is not identical every day. Some mornings begin groggily, some afternoons bring unexpected sleepiness, some evenings feel strangely alert, and some late nights are carried along by stress, screens, or the very poor decision to start a complex task at 11:30. That is because sleep pressure does not act alone. Your circadian rhythm, the internal timing system that helps coordinate the body over roughly 24 hours, works alongside it. You can think of these as two overlapping forces. One asks, "How long have you been awake?" The other asks, "What time does your body think it is?" Adenosine is deeply involved in the first question. It helps track the growing cost of wakefulness itself. That distinction matters because it explains some common oddities of daily life. You can wake up after too little sleep and feel very sleepy, because your adenosine-related sleep pressure never fully came down. You can also hit a late evening burst of alertness despite having been awake a long time, because circadian arousal is briefly helping prop you up. But keep going, and the homeostatic pressure does not disappear. It continues to build. Wakefulness continues to leave its chemical trace, whether you feel temporarily heroic about it or not. There is also a useful reason adenosine works through signaling rather than some dramatic all-or-nothing cut-off. The brain does not want to force sleep at the first sign of use. That would make for a very short workday and some awkward public transport situations. Instead, it allows alertness and tiredness to be balanced dynamically. Wake-promoting systems can still function for many hours. Motivation, light, activity, emotion, and novelty can keep you going. But as adenosine rises, the balance gradually shifts. Wakefulness becomes harder to sustain at full quality. The brain begins to lean towards sleep. This leaning happens through receptors, tiny molecular docking sites on cells that allow signals like adenosine to have effects. Adenosine binds to specific receptors in the brain, and when it does, it tends to reduce neural activity in certain wake-promoting circuits and promote the conditions associated with sleepiness. Two receptor types, called A1 and A2A, are especially important in discussions of sleep and arousal. Their behavior is a bit technical in full detail, but the broad point is wonderfully simple. As adenosine builds, it gains more influence. It tells parts of the brain to ease off. It lowers the background push for alertness. It makes being awake feel less compelling and sleep feel more appropriate. That is why adenosine is not best imagined as a sedative poured into the system at bedtime. It is more like a gradually strengthening vote. Each hour awake adds to it. Each spell of metabolic work gives it a little more presence. By the end of the day, that vote is much harder for the brain to ignore. It is also why your level of activity matters in a nuanced way. Intense mental effort, sustained attention, emotional strain, physical exertion, illness and recovery can all shape how tired you feel, but the overall framework remains the same. Being awake means cellular work is continuing, and that work contributes to the biochemical story. Even a quiet day leaves a trace. You do not need to run a marathon or solve advanced mathematics to build sleep pressure. Existing in a conscious, responsive, metabolically active state is enough. Your brain has no off mode while you're awake. It is always paying for something. There is a quiet comfort in that, I think. It means tiredness has a reason that is not mysterious in the irritating sense. It is not a random flaw. It is not your body turning against you because you sat down in a warm room. It is the expected outcome of prolonged wakefulness in a brain that uses energy to keep you alert, aware, and functioning. Adenosine is one of the ways that cost becomes visible in experience. You can see the importance of this system most clearly when sleep is delayed too long. If someone stays awake far beyond their usual bedtime, sleep pressure can become intense, attention fragments, mood worsens, reaction time slows. Very brief intrusions of sleep-like activity, sometimes called micro-sleeps, can occur. These are tiny lapses, sometimes only seconds long, where the brain begins slipping towards sleep, even while the person is technically still trying to remain awake. That is not the result of weak character. That is what happens when biological sleep pressure has been pushed past polite negotiation. In that sense, adenosine and the broader homeostatic sleep system protect the organism from the fantasy of endless wakefulness. Human beings often talk as though wakefulness is the default valuable state, and sleep is a pleasant interruption. Biology is less sentimental about it. From the brain's perspective, wakefulness is productive but costly, and sleep is essential maintenance. Adenosine helps enforce that truth. It is part of the mechanism that says, eventually, enough. Now, it is tempting here to picture adenosine simply piling up like dust on a bookshelf, but the reality is more dynamic. Brain chemistry is never a matter of one thing sitting still in a corner getting taller. Molecules are produced, used, cleared, transformed, recycled, and signaled through constantly. What matters is that during wakefulness, the balance shifts in such a way that adenosine signaling rises. More wakefulness generally means more sleep pressure. Then, during sleep, that pressure comes down again. We will spend more time later with what sleep does to reset the system, but for now it is enough to notice the elegant loop. Wakefulness builds the need for sleep, and sleep reduces the pressure created by wakefulness. That loop is so fundamental that much of your daily life is built around it without you thinking about it. You rely on being able to stay awake through the day, yet also on becoming sleepy enough at night to sleep well. The body needs both sides of the cycle. If adenosine did not rise with wakefulness, falling asleep would be far more difficult and far less reliable. If it rose too fast or failed to clear appropriately, ordinary functioning would become a mess. The fact that most people, most days, can move from alertness into tiredness and from sleep into wakefulness without needing a committee meeting is actually a tremendous biological achievement. And still, because it is familiar, we tend to treat it casually. We notice sleepiness mostly when it becomes inconvenient. We complain about the afternoon slump, the early alarm, the long drive, the meeting that seems specifically designed to explore the limits of human consciousness. But underneath all those familiar moments, adenosine is doing patient, unspectacular work. It is helping translate time spent awake into a message the brain can understand. It is saying, gently at first and then with growing insistence, that being conscious has consequences. It is also worth noticing that adenosine is not evil. It is easy to treat anything associated with tiredness as a nuisance to be defeated, especially in a culture that worships alertness and productivity. But adenosine is not the villain of the story any more than hunger is the villain of lunch. It is a signal with a purpose. If it did not rise, you would lose an important guide to rest. Without sleep pressure, sleep itself would become untethered from the actual needs of the brain. You might stay awake far too long, perform badly, and fail to recover properly. Adenosine helps prevent that. It keeps wakefulness honest. There is a certain irony in how often we interfere with this system and then act surprised when the body objects. We delay bedtime, we add bright light, we keep our mind stimulated. We ask the brain to be socially charming and cognitively sharp. At hours it would very much prefer not to be. Then we wonder why sleep arrives awkwardly or late, or why mornings feel hostile. But from the body's point of view, the logic remains steady. Wakefulness builds pressure. Pressure asks for sleep. Ignore it, and the system becomes louder. Work with it, and the transition is usually far gentler. You can feel this most clearly on days when you rise early, stay busy, and then let yourself wind down naturally. By evening, there is often a clean kind of sleepiness. Not glamorous, not philosophical, just clear. The eyes grow heavy. The mind stops pretending it wants more stimulation. The body becomes increasingly attached to soft surfaces. That is sleep pressure doing what it is meant to do. Adenosine has been at work all day, quietly contributing to that shift from wakefulness toward rest. And because this process is gradual, it can teach you something about the body's general style. Much of biology is not loud until it has to be. It prefers accumulation, thresholds, feedback loops, layered signals, and gentle corrections. Adenosine fits that pattern beautifully. It does not need to announce itself. It only needs to rise steadily enough that the brain eventually listens. That is, perhaps, why it pairs so well with the feeling of evening. Tiredness often feels soft at first, easy to dismiss, almost polite. Then it becomes harder to ignore. Words blur, concentration frays, thoughts become less determined to stay upright. And somewhere behind those familiar sensations is the biochemical record of a day spent awake. Every hour has contributed. Every bit of neural work has added to the pressure. Wakefulness has slowly made its own ending more likely. So when sleepiness returns, as it always does, it is worth seeing it not as a random collapse, but as the result of a long, ongoing process. Wakefulness has been busy. The brain has been expensive. ATP has been used. Energy has been spent, and adenosine signaling has gradually risen with it. That rise in signal is one of the reasons the mind begins to dim and the body begins to yield. It is the slow arithmetic of being awake, translated into a feeling you know very well. And once you understand that, the next question becomes especially interesting, because adenosine is doing more than merely making you feel tired. It is trying to tell the brain something useful, and the meaning of that signal is gentler, wiser, and more protective than it first appears. If adenosine helps create sleep pressure, then the next sensible question is why it keeps rising in the first place. Why should the brain make more of it simply because you have been awake for longer? Why does a full day of ordinary living leave behind this growing chemical insistence that maybe, just maybe, you ought to stop answering emails, stop reorganizing drawers, and stop pretending that late-night decision-making is one of your gifts? The answer begins with a simple fact that is easy to overlook because it never stops being true. Being awake is expensive. Not emotionally, though, sometimes that too, biologically. Wakefulness is not a neutral background state where the brain merely waits around in a pleasant silence until something interesting happens. Even in quiet moments, the brain is active. It is maintaining your sense of the world, keeping track of the body, filtering sounds, managing posture, monitoring internal states, storing bits of memory, anticipating what comes next, and producing the endless stream of thoughts that makes human consciousness so impressive and so occasionally exhausting. Even when you're doing very little on purpose, your brain is doing quite a lot by default. That work costs energy. Every nerve cell depends on finely controlled electrical and chemical activity. Neurons fire signals. They release neurotransmitters. They restore ion balances after each burst of activity. They keep membranes stable and ready for the next message. All of that requires ATP, the cell's quick-use form of energy. ATP is not a philosophical concept or a motivational slogan. It is the practical fuel that allows cells to keep going. When cells use ATP, it is broken down and recycled in the ordinary business of life. Adenosine is part of that energetic economy. It sits inside ATP as part of its structure, which means that whenever energy is being handled, spent, regenerated and managed, adenosine-related chemistry is never far away. That is one reason adenosine builds across the waking day. It is not as though the brain has a tiny clerk with a clipboard, carefully adding 1 unit of tiredness every hour. It is more direct than that and more elegant. Wakefulness requires sustained metabolic activity, and sustained metabolic activity helps increase adenosine signaling over time. The longer the brain remains active, the more opportunity there is for the chemistry of energy use to leave behind this growing trace. In that sense, adenosine is not added as punishment for staying awake. It is produced as a consequence of what wakefulness is. This makes tiredness feel much more sensible. If being awake is a period of ongoing cellular work, then it would be odd if the brain had no way of monitoring the cost of that work. There needs to be some link between the activity of the day and the need for restoration at night. Adenosine helps form that link. It translates time spent awake into a message the nervous system can respond to. That message becomes stronger with continued wakefulness because the underlying activity continues. More wakefulness means more metabolic demand. More metabolic demand means more opportunity for adenosine to accumulate and signal, and that, in turn, means more pressure to sleep. It helps here to imagine the waking brain not as a light bulb that is simply either on or off, but as a city running through the day. In the morning, power comes online, transportation begins, offices open, communication lines hum, deliveries arrive, waste must be processed, repairs are made while other systems keep moving, nothing stands still. By afternoon, the city has been busy for hours, traffic has flowed, resources have been used, maintenance needs have increased. By night, even if the streets still appear lively, there is a growing need for systems to slow, reset, clear, and recover. The brain is not literally a city, of course, though it does occasionally resemble one during a stressful Tuesday. But the comparison helps show why simple wakefulness creates the need for compensating processes. Activity does not vanish without a trace. It leaves requirements behind. One of the lovelier details in this story is that neurons are not doing all of this alone. The brain also contains support cells called astrocytes, which are deeply involved in maintaining the environment around neurons, helping with metabolism, regulating chemical balance, and supporting communication. For a long time, support cells were treated a bit like backstage staff in an overly proud theatre production. Important, yes, but not the stars. Modern neuroscience has been much kinder to them. Astrocytes play active roles in brain function, and they are part of the story of adenosine as well. They help manage energy and signaling in ways that contribute to how sleep pressure develops. So even the quiet background workers of the brain, if one may call them that without causing offence among neurobiologists, are involved in preparing you to get tired. This is one reason the build-up of sleep pressure feels so tied to lived experience. A long, mentally demanding day often feels more tiring than a short, gentle one. Emotional strain can make wakefulness feel heavier. Physical exertion changes the body's state in ways that influence rest and recovery. Illness often brings a kind of tiredness that feels weightier and less negotiable than usual. These different forms of effort are not all identical, but they all involve changing patterns of metabolic demand, signaling, and cellular work. The more the body and brain are engaged, the more obvious it becomes that rest will later be required. But even a calm day builds adenosine. This matters because it prevents us from thinking of tiredness only as a response to special strain. You do not need to solve an engineering problem, run a race, or survive a difficult family lunch in order to create sleep pressure. Simply being awake does it. Seeing, hearing, thinking, balancing, deciding, remembering, moving through rooms, regulating temperature, digesting food, and maintaining the basic condition of conscious life is enough. The brain is busy from the moment you wake, whether you spend the day in complex work or in remarkably committed loafing. There is no version of wakefulness that costs nothing. That cost accumulates with a kind of patient logic. Early in the day, you may not feel it. The brain has been active, certainly, but the balance still favours alertness. As hours pass, however, the accumulated effects become harder to ignore. If you have ever noticed that your focus begins to fray at a particular point in the afternoon, or that simple tasks feel more irritating in the evening, or that your tolerance for nonsense declines sharply after a certain hour, you're seeing the behavioural face of a process that has been building all along. Adenosine does not wait for your permission. It rises quietly in the background, making wakefulness gradually less effortless. This also explains why naps can feel so powerful. A short period of sleep can reduce sleep pressure enough to change the entire mood of a day. The world does not become objectively easier after a nap. The laundry is still there, The messages remain foolish. The kitchen has not repented. But your relationship to these things changes because one of the core forces driving sleepiness has been partially relieved. That relief is not magic. It reflects the fact that sleep helps reduce the pressure that wakefulness created. We will spend more time with that later, but it is useful to notice how much sense it makes. If the day builds adenosine through sustained activity, then sleep should lower the signal by giving the system space to reset. There is something wonderfully fair about this arrangement. The brain does not demand rest out of laziness. It demands rest because it has been working, and because the very chemistry that supports wakefulness eventually helps mark the limit of continued wakefulness. In that sense, the day builds its own ending. The longer you remain active, the more the conditions for sleep strengthen. Adenosine is one of the ways biology turns time spent awake into a need the body can no longer politely ignore. Now, because the human species cannot encounter a sensible regulatory system without immediately trying to outsmart it, this is the point where many of us begin interfering. We push through. We stay up later. We call it discipline, ambition, fun, revenge bedtime procrastination, or just one more episode. We flood the evening with light, noise, thoughts, and stimulation, then act surprised when the body becomes a little confused about what's expected of it. Yet beneath all that cultural chaos, the molecular arithmetic remains wonderfully stubborn. If you are awake, metabolic work continues. If metabolic work continues, adenosine signaling rises. Your opinions on the matter are noted and largely ignored. This is especially noticeable after sleep loss. If you have not slept enough, you do not start the next day at the same baseline. Some sleep pressure remains. In plain terms, you wake up with some of yesterday still on the books. Then a new day of wakefulness begins building more. That is why insufficient sleep can create such a particular kind of misery. It is not just that you are beginning the day tired. It is that the normal build-up of pressure starts from an already elevated point. By afternoon, the gap between what your brain needs and what you are asking of it can feel quite dramatic. The result is that familiar state where you're technically upright, technically speaking in complete sentences, and technically capable of continuing, but only in the way an umbrella in a storm is technically still doing its best. This accumulated logic also helps explain why chronic sleep restriction can be so deceptive. People often imagine that if they are getting by, they must be adapting well, but functioning is not the same as being fully restored. Many people can operate for quite some time on insufficient sleep, especially if routines are familiar and caffeine is enlisted like a loyal but morally ambiguous deputy. Yet performance, mood, attention, and resilience still suffer. The body keeps building adenosine during each waking day, and if sleep is too short or too poor to reduce that pressure adequately, the system drifts toward a more fatigued normal. The person may feel they are used to it, but biology has not become impressed. It has simply become consistently burdened. One can also see the logic of adenosine in how sleep pressure behaves after especially stimulating days. Imagine a day filled with problem solving, social interaction, physical movement, bright lights, travel, and emotional effort. By evening, even if the mind feels strangely busy, there may be a deeper exhaustion underneath. That exhaustion is not only psychological. The body and brain have been metabolically engaged for hours on many fronts at once. It would be surprising if such a day did not leave behind a stronger need for recovery. Adenosine is part of how that need becomes legible. Still, it is important not to treat adenosine as if it operates alone in a lonely room. The brain is not ruled by single causes. Circadian timing matters, stress hormones matter, light exposure matters, illness matters, temperature, emotion, meals, exercise, medication, habits, and expectation all matter. But adenosine remains special because it captures something so fundamental and unavoidable. It reflects the cost of being awake itself. Other factors may amplify or mask the feeling, but underneath them, the work of the day keeps leaving its trace. There is also a nice honesty to the way adenosine works. It does not care how virtuous your reason for staying awake may be. Writing a thesis, caring for a baby, worrying about tomorrow, watching documentaries about medieval bridges, and scrolling through nonsense on a glowing rectangle all produce wakefulness. From the point of view of sleep pressure, the brain has still been up, still been active, still been metabolically engaged. Biology can distinguish many things, but it is not especially sentimental about whether your late night was noble or ridiculous. Awake is awake. That may be one of the reasons people so often feel puzzled by their own tiredness. They judge it by what they did rather than by the cost of being conscious while doing it. Someone may say, "But I didn't do much today," meaning they were not especially productive in the modern heroic sense. Yet they may still feel tired because the brain does not charge only for visible achievement. It charges for wakefulness, regulation, thought, sensory processing, emotional containment, and the hidden labour of staying human throughout a day. A person may spend hours waiting, worrying, commuting, planning, or quietly coping, and still come away worn out. The chemistry of the nervous system recognises effort in broader terms than productivity culture does. This makes adenosine almost oddly compassionate as a concept. It reminds us that tiredness is not always something one earns by impressive exertion. Sometimes it is simply what happens when a living system remains awake and engaged for long enough. It is not a verdict, it is not a weakness, it is a record. And because it is a record, it helps prepare the brain for what comes next. Sleep is not a decorative luxury tacked onto the end of a day. It is the answer to demands created throughout that day. Adenosine rises because wakefulness must eventually give way to restoration. The brain needs periods when different priorities take over, when outward responsiveness can fall and internal maintenance can proceed more fully. The build-up of adenosine is one of the ways the body makes sure this transition actually happens. It is also why the onset of evening sleepiness can feel so deserved. Not always convenient, certainly, especially if one has deadlines or children or a dangerous amount of confidence, but deserved. Your brain has been working since morning. It has kept you oriented in the world, managed your thoughts, supported your choices, regulated your body, and carried the ongoing expense of conscious life. By night, adenosine has been rising for hours as part of that process. The heavy eyes and slower thinking of evening are not abrupt betrayals. They are the visible edge of a day's worth of metabolic truth. And once you begin to see it that way, sleepiness becomes less mysterious and more meaningful. The day builds adenosine because the day is made of activity. The longer the brain stays awake, the more it uses energy, the more it shifts its internal chemistry, and the more strongly it begins to signal the need for rest. It is not trying to ruin your plans. It is trying to keep the larger cycle of wakefulness and recovery in balance. That's why the brain makes more adenosine the longer you are awake, not to annoy you, not to be dramatic, but to say, with increasing clarity, that wakefulness has been expensive and that the bill, sooner or later, must be paid in sleep. And that is where the story becomes gentler than it first appears, because adenosine is not really an enemy creeping in through the evening. It is a signal with a purpose, a small molecular messenger carrying a surprisingly reasonable message. The heaviness it brings is not there to punish, but to guide. Beneath the fog, beneath the yawns, beneath the slow surrender of attention, the brain is not merely shutting down. It is trying to tell you something useful about what it needs. By the time most people hear the word adenosine explained, they have already formed a quiet opinion about it, and the opinion is not especially warm. It is usually presented as the thing that makes you sleepy, the chemical that drifts in and ruins your focus, the molecular party pooper that turns a lively afternoon into a negotiation with your own eyelids. Once caffeine enters the conversation, adenosine can sound even more suspicious, as though it were the villain in a story where coffee arrives in a cape. But that is not really what is happening. Adenosine is not a saboteur. It is not a lazy little nuisance floating through the brain trying to cancel your ambitions. It is a signal, and like many useful signals in the body, it can feel inconvenient precisely because it is doing its job. This is a recurring theme in biology. The things that keep us safe, balanced, and alive are not always the things we enjoy in the moment. Hunger interrupts. Pain complains. Fever makes a scene. Inflammation can be rude. Even anxiety in its original form is not designed as cruelty. It is designed as protection, albeit protection that often gets a bit over-enthusiastic in the modern world. Adenosine belongs in that family of misunderstood messengers. Its purpose is not to make your life smaller. Its purpose is to tell the brain something honest about what has been happening all day long. You have been awake, you have been active, you have been spending energy, and the system is moving closer to the point where recovery should take priority. That is what adenosine is really trying to tell you. Not give up, not you are weak, not you have failed to become one of those mythical adults who can function elegantly on very little sleep. It is saying something much plainer and much kinder. It is saying, this waking state has a cost. It is saying, you have been using the machinery. It is saying the brain is beginning to need what sleep provides. There is something deeply reassuring about that once you let it settle. Many people experience tiredness as accusation. They feel sleepy and turn it into a moral story. They should be doing more. They should be sharper. They should be more disciplined, more resilient, more machine-like. But the body is not speaking in moral language. It is speaking in regulatory language. Adenosine does not rise because you have disappointed it. It rises because the brain has been doing exactly what brains do while awake. It has been processing, responding, maintaining, adapting, monitoring, remembering, planning, filtering, and keeping you tethered to the world. The signal of sleepiness is not a judgment on that work. It is evidence of it. This matters because the way we interpret bodily signals affects how we live with them. A hungry person who understands hunger as useful information will usually respond differently from someone who treats it as a personal flaw. The same is true of tiredness. If sleepiness feels like failure, you are more likely to fight it with resentment, deny it, or treat rest as indulgence. If sleepiness feels like guidance, you may still delay it when needed, because life has a great many unreasonable habits, but you are less likely to hate yourself for being human. Adenosine helps make sleep feel necessary, not because necessity is embarrassing, but because necessity is real. It also helps to notice that the brain could not simply rely on your opinions here. Consciousness is wonderfully inventive, but it is not always sensible. People are quite capable of talking themselves into staying awake for reasons that range from noble to spectacularly foolish. There is work to finish. There is a child to care for. There is a deadline, a worry, a crisis, a celebration, a screen, a new thought about curtains, or a sudden desire to learn everything about Roman road engineering at midnight. If the body waited for explicit permission from your conscious preferences before creating a push towards sleep, many of us would end up making terrible bargains with ourselves on a nightly basis. Adenosine bypasses the speeches. It creates pressure whether or not your calendar agrees. That pressure is not meant to be cruel. It is more like the body's version of a firm reminder. Imagine if your home had a system that quietly measured heat, air quality, and structural strain, then gently advised when something needed attention before the whole place became uninhabitable. You would not call that system your enemy. You would call it useful, even if its timing occasionally annoyed you. Adenosine is part of that kind of design. It reflects the strain of sustained wakefulness and makes the need for rest increasingly difficult to ignore. Without such a system, the brain would be far more vulnerable to the fantasy that wakefulness can simply continue without consequence, and that fantasy is very tempting. Modern culture practically feeds it by hand. We are surrounded by the idea that productivity is virtue and rest is negotiable. The ideal person, in this strange mythology, is endlessly alert, infinitely available, emotionally stable, mentally sharp, physically capable, socially responsive, and somehow also relaxed. This person is, of course, either fictional or supported by an alarming number of systems behind the scenes. Real nervous systems do not operate like that. They require cycles, they accumulate need, they depend on restoration. Adenosine is part of the mechanism that keeps those realities from being completely erased by ambition and overhead lighting. There is also a very practical reason adenosine should be understood as a signal rather than a villain. It does not create tiredness for no reason. It is pointing towards something the brain genuinely needs. Sleep is not just the absence of wakefulness. It is an active, structured, biologically important state in which a great many essential processes occur. Memory is processed. Metabolic balance shifts. Neural systems recalibrate. Various forms of cellular housekeeping become more prominent. Emotional regulation benefits. Performance can be restored. Exactly how all of these processes fit together is still being studied in wonderful detail, but the broad truth is well established. Sleep is not decorative, it is necessary. Adenosine helps ensure that necessity is felt. One might think of it as a translator. The brain spends the day engaged in countless energetic and cognitive tasks, most of which you will never notice directly. Adenosine helps translate the cumulative burden of that activity into an experience the conscious person can actually respond to. You do not feel ATP being spent. You do not sense neurons restoring ion gradients or astrocytes doing their support work. But you do feel drowsiness. You do notice heavy eyes, slower thinking, reduced patience, and the growing sense that perhaps all meaningful civilization should now involve blankets. Adenosine is one of the ways the hidden work of wakefulness becomes visible at the level of felt experience. That felt experience can be frustrating, of course. Signals are not always convenient. A body that says enough in the middle of a late shift or during the last hour of study or at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday is not always making your life easy. But convenience is not the same as usefulness. The signal may be awkward because the world often asks us to override healthy rhythms. That does not make the signal wrong. In fact, the more modern life encourages artificial light, long work days, erratic schedules, and endless stimulation, the more valuable it becomes to understand that sleepiness is not a system error. It is often the last honest voice in a very noisy environment. That honesty is perhaps what makes caffeine so interesting, because caffeine does not erase the need adenosine is pointing to. It merely interferes with the message for a while. It blocks the receptors through which adenosine exerts some of its sleepy influence, and as a result you feel more awake. But the day's work has still happened. The metabolic cost has still been incurred. The underlying need for rest has not been solved, only partly masked. This is not an argument against caffeine, which has earned its place in human civilization with some dignity, but it does show why adenosine should not be cast as the bad actor in a simple contest. If anything, it is the honest reporter being shushed while the meeting continues. And yet even when masked, the signal remains meaningful. You can sense this on days when caffeine helps but does not quite save you. The mind may be somewhat clearer, but the body still feels worn. Or the alertness it provides can feel thinner, more brittle, less deeply restored than true rest. That is because waking chemistry can be rearranged temporarily, but the need for sleep cannot be negotiated out of existence forever. Adenosine keeps reminding the brain that wakefulness has gone on for some time. Block the reminder, and you may postpone the reckoning, but not abolish it. There is something almost humble in that. Adenosine is not demanding anything dramatic. It is not asking for a spiritual retreat or a fresh start or 3 weeks in a cabin near a lake. It is asking for sleep. It is asking for the ordinary, unglamorous, extremely important state that living brains require. The signal is basic because the need is basic. It is one of the many ways the body insists that care begins with rhythms more ancient than personal branding. If you listen closely, sleepiness often carries useful information beyond the simple message of go to bed. It can tell you something about how the day has gone. A very sleepy morning may suggest inadequate or poor quality sleep the night before. A sudden afternoon wall may hint at circadian timing, accumulated pressure, a heavy meal, or insufficient rest across several days. A restless, sleepy but not sleeping evening may suggest that sleep pressure is present, but being countered by stress, light, late caffeine, or mental overstimulation. Adenosine is not the whole explanation in each of these situations, but it is part of the language in which the body is speaking. Once you begin to see tiredness as communication, you become better at interpreting the message. That does not mean you will always obey it immediately. Human life is full of compromise. Parents do not get to nap because adenosine has made a persuasive case. Shift workers cannot simply align with biology because biology prefers it. Students, carers, medical staff, travellers, and countless others regularly live in conditions where the body's signals must be negotiated with circumstances that do not care. But understanding the signal still matters. It adds clarity. It replaces shame with structure. It reminds you that when you feel tired, there is usually a real reason, and that reason is not personal weakness. Children show this quite beautifully, though not always pleasantly. A tired child often becomes unreasonable in ways that are funny only if you are not responsible for them in the moment. Tears appear without warning. Logic collapses. Socks become offensive. Dinner is either unacceptable or emotionally overwhelming. It is rarely difficult to see that what is needed is sleep. Adults are more practiced at disguising the same truth, but not always by much. A tired adult may become snappish, distracted, indecisive, sentimental, careless, or deeply attached to sitting down for a minute. The signal is the same, just dressed in more adult clothing. This is one reason it helps to be kinder to yourself in the presence of sleepiness. If adenosine is a messenger rather than a threat, then tiredness becomes something to respond to intelligently, not something to resent. You can ask, "What is this telling me?" instead of, "What is wrong with me?" Sometimes the answer will be obvious. You've been awake too long. Sometimes it will be layered. Perhaps you're carrying sleep debt, stress, emotional strain, or a rhythm that has been pushed around by light and scheduling. But the question itself is better. It opens the possibility of care instead of criticism. There is also a quiet dignity in respecting signals before they become emergencies. Bodies are remarkably patient. They begin with hints, a yawn, a slower blink, a little mental friction, the odd sensation that your most important task now may be locating a pillow. Ignore enough of those hints and the body becomes firmer. Attention lapses, mood worsens, errors increase. Eventually wakefulness can begin to fragment in ways that are not merely inconvenient but unsafe. Adenosine is part of this escalation. The signal starts gentle because regulation is gentler when it can be. That does not mean it is optional. It means the system prefers cooperation to force, and perhaps that is the nicest way to think of it. Adenosine is inviting cooperation. It is not storming through the door with dramatic music. It is simply increasing the weight of a very reasonable suggestion. The day has gone on. The brain has worked. The restorative part of the cycle needs its turn. When the eyes grow heavy and the thoughts begin to drift, adenosine is not trying to ruin a perfectly good evening. It is trying to hand the evening over to the next necessary thing. Seen in that light, there is something almost comforting about the whole arrangement. Your body keeps count for you. It does not ask you to consciously track every unit of mental effort, every hour of sustained wakefulness, every bit of energy spent maintaining the extraordinary business of being alive and aware. It handles that in the background, then sends a signal when the balance has shifted. That signal is imperfectly timed sometimes, because life is messy and biology is always interacting with other forces, but the underlying intention is sane. Adenosine is keeping watch over a cycle you depend on even when you ignore it. So when sleepiness comes, as it always does, it may help to meet it with a slightly different attitude. Not with panic, not with annoyance, not with the immediate assumption that something is wrong, but with curiosity. What has the day asked of the brain? How long have you been awake? What has been building quietly in the background? What is the signal trying to protect? Often the answer will be simple. It is trying to protect tomorrow. It is trying to protect attention, mood, memory, reaction time, emotional steadiness, and the general quality of being a person with access to higher thought. It is trying to protect the brain from the charming but terrible idea that it can simply go on forever. That is what adenosine is really trying to tell you. Not that you are weak, but that you are finite. Not that you have failed, but that wakefulness costs something. Not that sleep is an interruption of life, but that it is part of life's maintenance. The heaviness, the slowing, the soft dimming of alertness are not evidence of a system breaking down. They are evidence of a system doing what it was designed to do, and once that begins to make sense, the next piece of the story becomes even more interesting, because adenosine does more than whisper that you need sleep. It changes how the brain thinks, feels, and functions on the way there, quietly turning down attention, focus, and energy long before your head ever reaches the pillow. If adenosine were only a quiet message saying, "You've been awake for a long time," it would still be important. But it does more than send a polite note. It changes the way the brain operates while that message is being delivered. As its influence grows, thought becomes slower, focus less steady, and energy less available. It does not usually happen in one dramatic instant. The brain does not go from sharp and lively to fully half asleep, as though someone pulled a theatrical lever. It happens more like a dimmer switch, gradually lowering the brightness of wakefulness until the mind, the body, and even the emotions begin to behave differently. That image of a dimmer switch is useful because it captures something very specific about tiredness. Sleepiness is not just a lack of enthusiasm. It is not the same as boredom, even though boredom can make it more obvious. It is not merely low motivation, though motivation often suffers along the way. It is a regulated reduction in the brain's willingness and ability to sustain high-quality alertness. Adenosine is one of the chemicals helping bring about that reduction. As it accumulates and binds to its receptors, it pushes parts of the brain away from full arousal and toward a state in which sleep becomes easier and sustained, focused wakefulness becomes harder. This is why tiredness has such a distinct mental texture. Thoughts do not vanish entirely. In fact, sometimes a tired mind becomes strangely busy. But their quality changes. Attention slips off tasks more easily. Working memory becomes less reliable. You may begin a sentence and lose the end of it halfway through. You may open something on your computer, then spend a full moment trying to remember why you opened it. You may reread the same paragraph and find that the words entered your eyes, passed through your brain, and left behind only the general impression that language is an ambitious project. This is not laziness. This is the dimmer switch turning. Part of what adenosine does is influence the balance between systems that promote wakefulness and systems that allow the brain to disengage from wakefulness. Certain neural circuits help keep you alert, responsive, and ready to interact with the world. These systems are not a single tidy switchboard, but a network involving several brain regions and several neurotransmitters, including things like norepinephrine, dopamine, acetylcholine, histamine, and orexin. Each has its role in supporting different aspects of alertness, motivation, and attention. Adenosine does not simply erase them all with one dramatic gesture. Instead, it interferes with the tone of wakefulness. It makes arousal harder to maintain. It reduces the push behind sustained attention. It helps tilt the brain away from high alert operation and toward rest. That gradual tilt can feel surprisingly personal because it touches so many parts of daily functioning. Focus is one of the first things people notice. When the brain is well rested, attention can be directed and held with relative ease, at least for a while. You can sit with a task, ignore distractions, and follow a line of thought from beginning to end. When adenosine pressure grows, that becomes more difficult. The mind wanders more readily. Small interruptions become more powerful. A noise from outside, a thought about dinner, the memory of an unanswered message, or the sudden conviction that perhaps now is the right time to reorganize bookshelves can all hijack your attention more easily than before. It is not that the world has become more distracting. It is that your brain has become less able to hold its chosen course through it. This is closely tied to working memory, that short-term mental space in which you keep bits of information active while using them. Working memory is the thing that lets you remember the second half of a sentence while processing the first half. Keep a phone number in mind long enough to write it down, follow several steps in a task, or hold an idea while comparing it with another. It is one of the most fragile but important features of thinking. Sleepiness narrows it. Adenosine helps make that narrowing more likely. When sleep pressure builds, the mind becomes less spacious. Fewer pieces stay in place at once. Complex tasks begin to feel slippery. Planning, reasoning, and decision-making all become more effortful because the brain is operating with less stable mental workspace. This matters more than people often realize. Many forms of intelligence in everyday life are not about knowing facts, but about holding, comparing, sorting, and updating information in real time. That is what gets harder as adenosine turns the dimmer downward. You do not suddenly become foolish in some dramatic way. You become subtly less capable of juggling the pieces that smart functioning requires. It is the difference between a desk with room to spread papers out and a desk so cluttered that every new document immediately slides to the floor. Reaction time slows as well. This is one of the more measurable effects of sleepiness, and it has consequences beyond the amusing private annoyance of walking into a room and taking an extra second to understand why. A tired brain responds more slowly to the environment. Signals are processed with less speed. Decisions take longer to form. Motor responses are delayed. In everyday life, that may look like clumsiness, hesitation, or mild absent-mindedness. In situations that require vigilance, driving, operating machinery, monitoring important information, it can be dangerous. The dimmer switch does not just lower the brightness of thought, it also changes the speed at which the brain notices and answers the world. There is something slightly unsettling in how quiet this change can be from the inside. People often feel less impaired than they actually are. One reason is that sleepiness reduces the very functions needed to judge performance accurately. Another is that the decline is often gradual. You adapt to the narrowing without realizing how much sharper you were earlier. It is rather like sitting in a room that grows dimmer and dimmer, but so slowly that you do not notice until someone asks you to read the label on something across the room. Adenosine works like that. The signal builds in the background, and by the time focus, memory, and response speed are noticeably different, the chemistry has been shifting for hours. Energy too changes under its influence, though it is worth being careful with that word. People often speak of energy as though it were one simple substance, like water in a bottle or charge in a battery. In reality, what we call energy in human experience is made up of many things. There is metabolic energy at the cellular level. There is alertness. There is motivation. There is emotional drive. There is physical willingness. There is mental readiness. Adenosine affects several of these at once, especially by reducing the brain's readiness to stay actively engaged. The result is that the body begins to feel heavier, the mind less eager to initiate effort, and even small tasks can seem disproportionately expensive. That sense of expensiveness is one of the clearest signs of the dimmer switch at work. A rested brain looks at a simple task and says, more or less, fine. A sleepy brain looks at the same task and says, must we? Replying to a message, tidying a surface, following instructions, making a choice, reading a page, getting up to refill a glass, all of these can feel as though they come with hidden administrative burden. Nothing objectively huge has changed, yet the cost of engagement feels higher. This is because adenosine is not simply creating a feeling of drowsiness in the abstract. It is altering the operational tone of the brain. It is reducing the drive that makes effort feel straightforward. This has an emotional side as well. A tired brain is generally a less patient brain. Emotional regulation depends on networks that require energy, coordination, and executive control. When sleep pressure rises, these systems become less graceful. minor frustrations feel sharper, social demands feel heavier, tolerance declines, humour may worsen, though confidence in one's humour sometimes increases in a most unhelpful way. People become more reactive, less measured, more likely to interpret neutral events as irritating, and less able to recover quickly from stress. Adenosine is not the only factor here, but by reducing the quality of alertness and control, it contributes to the familiar truth that everything seems more dramatic when you're tired. That is one reason sleepiness can distort judgment. It does not only slow thinking, it changes the emotional weather in which thinking occurs. A tired person may become more pessimistic, more impulsive, less socially attuned, or more tempted by easy rewards. The long-term sensible choice requires a kind of mental steadiness that is harder to maintain when the dimmer switch has moved low enough. This is why people make strange decisions when they are exhausted. The tired brain is not merely slower, it is less balanced in how it weighs effort, reward, risk, and discomfort. There is a lovely irony in the fact that one of the things adenosine does best is make the brain less interested in resisting adenosine. The more sleep pressure grows, the harder it becomes to mount the sort of sharp, organised, purposeful wakefulness that would otherwise help you push through. This is sensible design. If tiredness left decision-making completely untouched, many people would simply decide against sleep far too often. Instead, the systems that support insistently focused consciousness begin to soften, making surrender to rest more likely. Of course, the word surrender may sound too dramatic for an experience that often looks like someone blinking at a laptop for a little longer than usual, but it captures the basic logic. Wakefulness is a held state. It requires systems to stay activated, focused outward, responsive, and metabolically ready. Adenosine helps loosen that hold. It allows the brain to become less committed to continuous outward engagement. That is why even very stimulating tasks become harder to maintain once sleep pressure is high enough. The brain begins, in a deeply physical way, to let go. This letting go is especially visible in sustained attention, the ability to keep monitoring something over time without drifting. Tasks that require constant vigilance are famously vulnerable to sleepiness. The dimmer switch makes it harder to remain steadily present. Attention begins to flicker. Gaps appear. A few seconds of mental absence may pass unnoticed. On the road, that can be dangerous. In quieter settings, it may simply look like staring at the same object without fully processing it, or drifting so far into inner fog that reality must knock twice before being admitted. This is also where microsleeps begin to make sense. When sleep pressure becomes very high, tiny fragments of sleep-like activity can intrude into wakefulness. The person may not even fully notice it. For a moment, attention is simply gone. A second later it returns, perhaps with a blink and a vague sense of having lost the thread. These brief lapses show just how far the dimmer can go before full sleep arrives. The brain does not always wait politely for a proper bedtime. If adenosine and other sleep-promoting forces become strong enough, wakefulness may begin to fragment even while the person is still technically awake. And yet, for much of the day, the effect is gentler than that. It lives in the small changes, the slower sentence, the increased effort, the lost word, the harder start, the decreased appetite for complexity, the tendency to choose easy, familiar, rewarding things over demanding, thoughtful ones. The odd sensation that your body has become more vertical than enthusiastic. Adenosine is one of the reasons these shifts appear. It is changing the cost structure of wakefulness, making high-level cognition less sustainable and restful, disengagement more attractive. One of the more interesting parts of this is that creativity can behave strangely under sleepiness. Often performance declines, especially where precision, logic, memory, and sustained attention are concerned. Yet some tired states can feel oddly loose or associative. Thoughts wander more freely. The mind drifts. Links appear between things that seemed separate before. This can give the impression that tiredness is somehow helping imaginative thought. Sometimes it does create a different mental texture, but it is an unreliable gift. What you gain in looseness, you often lose in clarity, follow-through, and evaluation. The dimmer switch may soften rigid focus, but it also reduces the sharpness needed to shape good ideas into useful form. Physical energy follows the same general logic. Movement requires planning, coordination, and willingness. As adenosine exerts more influence, even the body can seem less eager to participate in the world. You may move more slowly, posture becomes less assertive, muscles feel less responsive, even if their raw strength is still there. The whole organism begins to behave like something preparing for reduced activity. This is exactly what should happen. Sleep is not just a mental state. It is a whole body transition, and adenosine helps guide the organism toward it. This guidance is not always welcome, especially if it arrives at a socially inconvenient moment. The brain does not particularly care that you're at the end of a long meeting, halfway through a report, or pretending to enjoy a film you chose too late in the evening. If the day has been long enough, adenosine will continue turning the dimmer. Your argument with it may be witty, but it is unlikely to be effective. Bright light, movement, conversation, or caffeine may buy you time, and sometimes important life absolutely requires that time. But the underlying signal remains. Focus is becoming costlier. Energy is becoming thinner. The brain is turning itself down. It is worth emphasizing again that this is not malfunction. It is preparation. A dimmer switch is not a broken bulb. It is a controlled change in state. Adenosine is not causing random deterioration. It is helping coordinate the descent from active wakefulness toward rest. The slowing of thought, the narrowing of focus, the reduction of energy, these are not meaningless losses. They make sleep more likely by making wakefulness less compelling and less sustainable. The system is arranged so that the need for sleep can eventually overcome the endless incentives to remain awake. There is something humane in that design, even if it feels annoying on a practical Tuesday. Your body's not asking you to solve the problem of sleep consciously from scratch every night. It is changing the experience of being awake so that sleep begins to feel increasingly sensible, then increasingly necessary. Adenosine helps do that by shaping the brain's operating mode long before you close your eyes. It dims the intensity of mental life just enough, then more, until the idea of continuing to think at full brightness becomes increasingly absurd. And once you see it that way, the familiar nightly shift feels less like a collapse and more like a guided descent. The thoughts soften because the brain is changing state. Focus loosens because sustained vigilance is no longer being prioritized. Energy fades because full engagement is no longer the goal. Adenosine is helping lower the lights from within, not to punish the mind, but to prepare it for something it needs. The result is that wakefulness slowly stops winning by default. Rest starts to sound reasonable, then appealing, then impossible to argue with for very long, which is exactly where the next part of the story begins. Because once adenosine has turned the dimmer low enough, sleep no longer feels like one option among many. It begins to feel like the obvious answer. Once adenosine has been at work for long enough, wakefulness begins to lose its natural advantage. Earlier in the day, staying awake often feels effortless, or at least automatic. The brain remains outward-facing. Attention has somewhere to go. The body is willing to cooperate. Even when tasks are dull, there's enough background alertness to keep the machinery running. But as sleep pressure builds, that balance changes. Rest begins to feel less like a pleasant option, and more like the correct answer to a question your body has been asking for hours. The need to stop grows heavier, clearer, and much harder to bargain with. That phrase, sleep pressure, is one of the plainest and most useful ways to describe what is happening. It does not mean sleep is lurking in the room like a villain in soft slippers. It means the biological drive for sleep is increasing the longer wakefulness continues. Adenosine is a central part of that process, but the experience itself is larger than one molecule. It becomes a whole body argument in favour of stopping. Your thoughts lose force. Your posture gives up its earlier ambitions. Attention starts leaking away around the edges. Tasks that once seemed manageable begin to feel oddly over-designed. The brain, after hours of activity, becomes less interested in the business of remaining fully engaged with the world. What is striking about this is how sensible it really is. The body does not merely run until it breaks. It starts making its case in stages. First, a little less sharpness, then more effort, then the heavy eyes, the longer blinks, the wandering attention, the increasing emotional fragility, the strong and sudden affection for soft furniture. Sleep pressure rises steadily, and fatigue becomes the lived experience of that rising pressure. Not fatigue in the broadest possible sense, because that word can mean many things, but the kind of fatigue that says, very specifically, continuing like this is becoming biologically expensive. There is a difference here worth noticing between tiredness as a sensation and sleep pressure as a process. Tiredness is how it feels from the inside. Sleep pressure is the accumulating drive beneath it. You can think of tiredness as the conscious translation of a deeper physiological reality. The brain has been awake, metabolically active, and gradually pushed toward a state where sleep is increasingly favoured. What you feel as heaviness, fog, irritability, or loss of momentum is the surface of that process. Beneath it, the biology has been keeping count all along. Fatigue, though, complicates matters slightly, because it is not always identical to sleepiness. A person can be physically fatigued after hard exertion, yet not especially sleepy in that moment. A person can be mentally exhausted after a day of decisions, and still somehow too wired to drift off easily. Stress can make the body feel awful, while simultaneously making rest difficult. So when rest starts to win, it is not simply because the body has run out of some generic substance called energy. It is because sleep pressure has reached a point where the systems supporting wakefulness are losing ground. The desire and eventually the need to stop is becoming stronger than the drive to continue. This can feel surprisingly dramatic in everyday life. There are evenings when you think you are functioning perfectly well, only to discover that your standards for perfectly well have become wildly generous. You stare at a message too long. You forget what you were about to do. You become offended by ordinary noise. You open a tab, close it, reopen it, and then suspect the tab may understand more than you do. These are not always signs of catastrophe. Very often they are signs that rest is beginning to win. The brain is no longer granting full support to your waking ambitions. It is preparing to hand the evening over to recovery. This is one reason the end of the day often changes the emotional meaning of effort. A simple job in the morning can feel almost neutral. The same job late at night can feel insulting. The task itself has not changed. What has changed is the cost of doing it. Sleep pressure increases the price of continued engagement. Every bit of attention feels more expensive. Every choice requires more will. Every interruption hits harder. It is rather like continuing a conversation after the room has slowly lost oxygen. Technically possible for a while, perhaps, but increasingly poor as a plan. The brain seems to know this before the conscious mind fully admits it. That is why people often reach for rest in small ways before they consciously decide they are tired. They sit down more, they lean on things, they stare without processing, they become quieter or, in some cases, bizarrely talkative in the way of the overtired. They move less efficiently. They switch from deliberate thought to passive consumption. The organism begins adjusting itself toward lower demand. Rest starts to win not only because sleep becomes more attractive, but because wakefulness becomes harder to perform gracefully. This is especially visible in the way attention begins to fail over time. Sustained attention is one of the most demanding forms of wakefulness. It requires the brain not just to remain conscious, but to remain steadily, selectively engaged with something often unglamorous. That is hard enough in ideal conditions. Add mounting sleep pressure, and it becomes increasingly fragile. The mind drifts. Blank patches appear. You realise you've been looking at a screen while thinking of something entirely unrelated. Or worse, of nothing at all, that curious empty interval where the brain seems to have placed itself briefly on standby. Fatigue is full of these tiny absences. They're not always obvious until you notice how many little pieces of the world are slipping through the net. This creeping weakness in attention is one of the ways the need to stop becomes persuasive. A tired brain is not merely telling you it would enjoy sleep. It is showing you, in performance after performance, that continued wakefulness is becoming lower quality. This is not moral theatre, it is regulation. If the brain remained perfectly sharp no matter how long you stayed awake, there would be far less incentive to rest before genuine danger arrived. Instead, cognitive quality begins declining before total collapse. The system gets less efficient, less careful, less patient, less accurate. This creates pressure not only in chemistry, but in experience. Being awake no longer feels worth the cost. There is also a deeply physical side to why rest starts to win. When sleep pressure is high enough, the body itself begins to cooperate less enthusiastically with active life. Movement can feel heavier. Coordination is a little less crisp. Even holding yourself upright seems slightly overcomplicated. It is not that the muscles have forgotten what to do. It is that the whole system is shifting toward reduced output. Sleep is approaching not as an abstract concept, but as a full-body state change. The body becomes more interested in stillness. Temperature regulation shifts. Muscular tension often softens. The ordinary forward momentum of wakefulness begins to ebb. Anyone who has ever fought to sleep on a long drive, in a warm room, or during a badly timed lecture has felt this directly. There is a point where the body begins offering increasingly forceful suggestions. Blink longer, adjust posture, yawn, rub eyes, shift around, attempt dignity, lose dignity. These are not random gestures. They are signs that wakefulness is becoming unstable and that the body is trying, with varying degrees of elegance, to manage the transition. Fatigue and sleep pressure together make continuing harder, not because the body is failing, but because it is trying to prevent a worse failure. In this sense, the need to stop is protective. It may not always feel kind in the moment, especially when you still have things to do, but it is not there to make you less useful. It is there to preserve function over time. A brain that never insisted on stopping would be a brain far more likely to make dangerous errors, accumulate unresolved stress, impair memory, destabilize mood, and degrade performance. Rest starts to win because the alternative, endless wakefulness, is a terrible bargain. Biology is not sentimental about this. It knows what prolonged wakefulness costs, and it builds systems that eventually force the issue. Of course, humans are talented at ignoring those systems for a while. We override, we push through, we claim a second wind and treat it like a legal exemption. Sometimes this is unavoidable. Parents cannot decline nighttime wakefulness because chemistry has filed an objection. Shift workers cannot simply persuade the world to reorganize itself around circadian wisdom. Emergencies, deadlines, illness, travel, grief, celebration, and badly chosen habits all interfere with the graceful rhythm the body would prefer. But even in those moments, rest is still trying to win. The signal remains. The costs keep rising. The quality of wakefulness keeps changing. One may postpone the outcome, but one does not cancel it. What makes the second win so misleading is that it feels like victory, when it's often only a temporary rearrangement. You are tired, and then suddenly you are not. At least not in the same way. The mind sharpens a bit. You become chatty. Ideas return. You begin making plans that a wiser version of you would have vetoed on procedural grounds. But this is often not true restoration. It is a shift in arousal, perhaps driven by stress hormones, activity, light, social stimulation, or the natural timing of alertness. Underneath it, sleep pressure may still be high. Rest has not stopped winning. It has merely been delayed at the door for a few minutes by circumstances with loud voices. The body's need to stop becomes clearest when it is denied for too long. Extended wakefulness does not just make you yawn more. It changes perception, reaction time, mood, decision-making, appetite, and even the stability of consciousness itself. Microsleeps can intrude. Thoughts become strangely disordered, emotions grow less manageable, reality starts to feel thinner, more effortful, less convincingly arranged. In extreme tiredness, the mind can behave in ways that are genuinely alarming. This is the far end of the same continuum that begins, harmlessly enough, with heavy eyelids and slower thinking. Rest wins at the gentle end if it can. If not, it keeps escalating its argument. There is something almost wise in that escalation. The signal of fatigue does not begin at maximum volume, because life requires flexibility. You need to be able to extend wakefulness sometimes. You need to be able to finish a task, care for another person, travel, adapt, or cope with the unexpected. But flexibility is not the same as limitlessness. Sleep pressure allows negotiation for a while, then gradually withdraws your better options. The later it gets, the harder good wakefulness becomes. Rest starts to win because the body reduces the reward and the effectiveness of staying awake. This helps explain why bedtime often feels different from one evening to another. On some nights, sleep arrives naturally, almost gratefully. You can feel that wakefulness has had its turn. On others, you feel tired but not settled, weary but not ready, sleepy in body yet restless in mind. That is because fatigue is shaped by more than one process. Stress, light exposure, late caffeine, emotional arousal, pain, and irregular schedules can all complicate the picture. Yet even in these messy states, sleep pressure is still part of the equation. Rest may be winning in one system while another system is shouting over it. The body wants to stop, but the mind may still be pacing in circles under artificial daylight and unfinished thoughts. That is perhaps why tiredness can sometimes feel cruel. The need to stop is present, but the ability to stop cleanly is not. Anyone who has lain in bed feeling clearly exhausted while their mind continues producing unsolicited commentary knows this particular frustration. It is tempting in those moments to imagine that the sleep system is badly designed. But more often it is simply being interfered with. Sleep pressure may be strong, but the conditions for sleep are being opposed by something else. Still, the pressure itself remains meaningful. It is telling the truth, even if the rest of the system has become noisy. The idea that rest starts to win may sound passive, but it is actually active in an important sense. Sleep is not a collapse into nothing. It is a shift toward another state with its own purposes and structure. The need to stop is not merely the need to cease. It is the need to allow different processes to take over. Memory needs sorting. Metabolic byproducts need handling. Emotional tone needs recalibration. Neural systems need patterns of activity that wakefulness does not provide. The push toward rest is therefore not simply about ending the day. It is about beginning the part of the cycle that repairs what wakefulness spent. This is why sleep pressure is such an intelligent design feature. It ties the need for recovery directly to the time spent being active. The more you have asked of the system, the more insistently it asks for restoration. Rest starts to win because the brain is built to preserve itself over days, months, and years, not merely to satisfy the latest impulse toward one more task. In a strange way, fatigue is a sign of long-term wisdom. It is the body refusing the short-term fantasy of endless output in favor of a larger balance. There is also a social misunderstanding here that is worth undoing. Because rest is quiet and fatigue looks like weakness from the outside, people often underestimate the seriousness of the need to stop. A person sitting silently, blinking more slowly, or losing their train of thought may not look as though anything remarkable is happening. But biologically, something important is being negotiated. Wakefulness is giving way. The body is trying to change states, Treating that as laziness is like treating hunger as poor attitude. It misses the point entirely. The system is not quitting, it is signalling. If anything, the need to stop is one of the most honest things the body does. It does not care for performance culture. It does not care how admirable your intentions sound at 11:45 p.m. It does not care that everyone else seems to be answering messages, building businesses, raising children, managing crises, and somehow also doing evening yoga in warm lighting. Your brain keeps its own record. It knows how long you have been awake. It knows what wakefulness has cost, and eventually it begins to make that cost impossible to ignore. That honesty can feel almost comforting when you stop fighting it quite so personally. Heavy eyes, slowed thought, reduced patience, clumsy attention, the longing to put your head down for just a moment. These are not random signs of decay. They are parts of a system nudging you toward the thing it knows you need. Rest starts to win because rest has become necessary. The body is not being dramatic, it is being accurate. And once you understand that, another very familiar piece of the puzzle becomes even more interesting, because for many people the moment rest starts to win is also the moment they reach for the small beloved substance that changes the whole conversation for a while. Adenosine may be building pressure, and fatigue may be making its case, but then coffee, tea, or some other caffeinated ally enters the room and briefly rearranges the terms of the argument. The need for rest does not vanish, but it can suddenly feel much less convincing, which is exactly why caffeine's trick works so well, and why it is not quite the same thing as solving the problem. There is a reason caffeine feels almost magical when you first think about it. You're tired, properly tired, the kind of tired where your thoughts seem to arrive wearing slippers. Your focus has become patchy, your body has started leaning towards stillness. Then you drink a cup of coffee or tea or something from a can that looks as though it was designed by a committee of electricians, and within a little while the world becomes more negotiable again. Your eyes lift, your mind sharpens. The day seems briefly restored to you. It is such a familiar transformation that many people talk about caffeine as though it gives them energy, in some direct and heroic sense, like pouring extra daylight into the bloodstream. But that is not quite what it does. Its trick is smaller, subtler, and in its own way more interesting. Caffeine does not truly end tiredness. It blocks one of the main signals that lets you feel it. That is the small deception. Not malicious, not exactly, and certainly beloved by a great many people, but a deception all the same. Adenosine has been building through the day, doing its patient accounting of wakefulness, gently increasing sleep pressure, and making rest feel more necessary. Then caffeine arrives and begins occupying the receptors adenosine would normally bind to. In effect, it sits in the chair before adenosine gets there. The signal is still being produced. The need for sleep has not vanished. The work of wakefulness has still happened, but some of the brain's ability to hear that signal has been muffled for a while. This is why caffeine is so effective and so limited at the same time. It can make you feel much more awake without actually undoing the biological conditions that made you sleepy. In ordinary life, that distinction is easy to miss because subjective experience is persuasive. If you feel more alert, it is natural to assume you have more energy in some fundamental sense. And to be fair, from the inside, that is often exactly how it feels. The fog lifts a little, conversation becomes easier, thoughts line up with more discipline. A task that looked unbearable 10 minutes ago now seems annoying but possible, which is a considerable improvement by most standards. Yet beneath that improved alertness, the accumulated sleep pressure is still there. Caffeine has changed the message, not erased the cause. That is one reason the effect can feel so strangely clean at first. True rest changes many things at once. It restores, recalibrates, reorganizes, and reduces sleep pressure by actually allowing sleep to occur. Caffeine, by contrast, is narrower. It chiefly interferes with adenosine signaling. That is enough to produce a real and often very useful improvement in wakefulness, because adenosine is such an important part of the sleepy push. But it does not give the brain the full benefits of sleep. It does not perform the night shift. It does not sort memory, reduce the metabolic consequences of a long waking day, or provide the deeper reset the brain has been moving toward. It merely makes wakefulness easier to continue for a while. There is something almost charming about the cleverness of this molecule. Caffeine resembles adenosine closely enough in structure that it can bind to some of the same receptors, especially the A1 and A2A receptors that matter so much in sleep and arousal. But unlike adenosine, caffeine does not activate those receptors in the same sleepy way. It blocks them. It stands in the doorway and prevents the usual message from getting through with its normal force. The result is that the brain's wake-promoting systems remain more active than they otherwise would. You feel less sleepy not because the day has demanded less of you, but because one of the signals reporting that demand has been partially interrupted. This explains a great many ordinary human rituals. The morning cup of coffee, for example, often feels like the moment the self returns from wherever it had gone overnight. Yet part of what is happening there is that caffeine is helping push back against residual sleep pressure. If you did not sleep enough, or if your adenosine levels are still relatively elevated when you wake, caffeine can make a noticeable difference. It does not create a fresh brain from nowhere, but it can make your existing one more available to you. In that sense, coffee is often less a gift of energy than a temporary reduction of interference. The afternoon cup is even more revealing. By then, the waking day has done some work. Adenosine has been rising, sleep pressure is becoming more obvious. Alertness often dips naturally in the mid-afternoon, as circadian timing and accumulated wakefulness briefly make a rather convincing case for horizontal arrangements. Enter caffeine, stage left, and suddenly the world regains edges again. The slump softens. You can continue, but the key point remains. The sleep pressure itself has not been paid off. It has simply become harder to feel at full strength. This is why caffeine can sometimes make tiredness seem to vanish, then reappear later with suspicious enthusiasm. As the caffeine wears off, the adenosine that has been quietly building all along is still there, and the receptors it was unable to influence so strongly begin becoming available again. The result can be a sense that sleepiness arrives not gradually, but all at once. People sometimes call this a crash, though the term can mean several things. In simple terms, part of what they are noticing is the return of a signal that was temporarily blocked. The tiredness did not spring into existence in that moment. It had been waiting its turn. There is something deeply human about how fond we are of this arrangement, despite knowing its limits. Perhaps that is because the limits are often entirely worth it. Caffeine is, after all, genuinely useful. It improves alertness, reaction time, vigilance, and in many people, mood and motivation as well. It can make a difficult morning manageable, a long drive safer, a demanding task possible, and an ordinary afternoon more civilized. There is no need to be morally dramatic about it. Human beings and caffeine have built a perfectly respectable working relationship over the centuries. The point is not that caffeine is bad, but that it is specific. It helps by disguising one part of tiredness, not by replacing what sleep actually does. That specificity becomes clearer the more sleep-deprived a person is. A mild shortfall of sleep can often be masked reasonably well with caffeine. The person may feel and function much better. But after substantial sleep loss, caffeine begins to show its limits. It may keep the person awake, it may improve performance somewhat, yet it often cannot restore the clarity, emotional steadiness, and cognitive flexibility of a truly rested brain. The reason is obvious once you understand the mechanism. Blocking adenosine can only do so much. If many other consequences of sleep deprivation are now in play, caffeine is no longer dealing with a simple sleepy signal. It is trying to prop up a system that has missed the restoration it genuinely needed. This is why caffeinated alertness can feel a little different from rested alertness. Rested alertness is usually steadier, deeper, less brittle. Thought feels available without strain, mood is more stable, attention is easier to direct. Caffeinated alertness can be excellent, but it may feel more forced at the edges, more dependent on momentum, more vulnerable to jitter, anxiety, or a rather theatrical confidence in one's ability to take on 6 things at once. That is because caffeine stimulates wakefulness by changing signaling, not by actually resolving the broader biological need behind sleepiness. It is like turning the music up in a car with a warning light on. Perfectly useful for finishing the journey perhaps, but not the same as fixing the engine. Dose matters here, of course. A modest amount of caffeine can sharpen attention pleasantly for many people. Too much can make the system overshoot. Then alertness begins to feel restless instead of clear. The heart may race a bit. Thoughts may become too quick and not especially improved by the extra speed. Anxiety may climb. Fine concentration can become harder rather than easier. A person may become both wide awake and weirdly unproductive, which is not the ideal balance. This too makes sense when one remembers that caffeine is not delivering clean restorative energy. It is blocking one signal and indirectly altering arousal systems, and more of that effect is not always better. There is also a timing problem built into caffeine's popularity, because the same mechanism that helps you feel awake can also make it harder to sleep later if used too late in the day. Caffeine lingers longer than many people suspect. Depending on the person and the circumstances, its half-life is often several hours, meaning a significant portion of it can still be active well into the evening if consumed in the afternoon. If adenosine is trying to make sleep feel possible and timely, caffeine can delay that by continuing to occupy receptors after you would have preferred it to mind its own business and leave. The result can be a very modern form of frustration, being tired in a vague, bodily way while not feeling sleepy enough to drift off easily. That state is particularly unpleasant, because it reveals the deception so clearly. The body needs rest. Sleep pressure exists, yet the brain's experience of that pressure has been scrambled just enough to delay the transition. You're not truly awake in the best sense, but not fully sleepy in the most useful sense either. It is rather like being held in a waiting room between states, and if that delayed sleep shortens the night, the next day often begins with more residual pressure, making caffeine seem even more necessary. This is how a very ordinary loop can form. You are tired, so you use caffeine. The caffeine helps, but perhaps too late in the day. Sleep suffers. The next day begins with greater need. The caffeine becomes more attractive. No great tragedy perhaps, but a tidy little system of mutual reinforcement. This is not universal because people differ. Some metabolize caffeine quickly, some are more sensitive to it than others. Genetics, liver enzymes, habitual use, body size, hormonal factors, age, medications, and sleep history all play roles in how strongly caffeine is felt and how long it lasts. One person can drink espresso after dinner and fall asleep without drama, which is both astonishing and faintly suspicious. Another becomes philosophically over-alert from half a cup at noon. Biology loves variation, and caffeine is no exception. Yet the underlying principle remains stable. However dramatic or subtle the experience, caffeine works by interfering with adenosine's message rather than abolishing the need that message represents. Habit complicates the picture as well. With regular caffeine use, the body adapts to some extent. Tolerance can develop, meaning the same dose produces less obvious effect over time. This is one reason a morning cup may stop feeling like a revelation and start feeling more like the restoration of legal consciousness. If caffeine has become part of the daily pattern, the brain may adapt its receptor systems and signaling environment accordingly. Then the absence of caffeine becomes noticeable too. Headache, sluggishness, irritability, and a deeper than usual sense that the day is poorly designed can appear when regular caffeine is suddenly withheld. Part of that experience reflects withdrawal, not simply the return of a normal baseline. Again, the mechanism matters. The system has grown used to a particular kind of interrupted signaling. Even so, it is worth saying plainly that caffeine is not the enemy either. If adenosine is not a villain, caffeine need not be a trickster in black clothing, twirling a molecular moustache. It is a useful compound that interacts with a useful system. The relationship is only worth understanding because it helps explain your experience. Why does coffee help when you are tired? Because it blocks part of the signal that tells you how tired you are. Why does it sometimes stop helping? Because it cannot replace sleep. Why can it interfere with bedtime? Because adenosine's message is still being muffled after you have moved into the part of the day when you would prefer to hear it clearly. There is also a subtle psychological piece to caffeine's deception. Because it can improve performance and subjectively lift alertness, it encourages the idea that tiredness has been solved. That can lead people to underestimate their need for rest, especially if they are functioning reasonably well. A caffeinated person may not feel how compromised they would otherwise feel, which is precisely the point of the coffee, but it can create false confidence. The task becomes possible, and so the person assumes the underlying state is fine. Yet biology keeps its own books. Sleep pressure continues to accumulate with wakefulness, and if sleep is delayed or reduced, the broader consequences of insufficient rest still unfold, even when one feels temporarily capable. This is especially important in tasks that require judgment, precision, or emotional steadiness. Caffeine can sharpen some aspects of performance beautifully, particularly vigilance and reaction speed, but it does not make an underslept brain identical to a well-rested one. The person may feel much better and still be operating below their best in subtler ways, less flexible, less patient, less accurate in complex reasoning, more emotionally reactive, or more likely to overestimate their own clarity. Again, none of this makes caffeine useless. It simply makes it what it is, an aid to wakefulness rather than a substitute for sleep. There is a kind of elegance in that limitation. Biology rarely offers free victories. Most shortcuts have a cost or a boundary. Caffeine's gift is real but temporary. It borrows alertness against a signal that has not been resolved. Eventually the bill comes due, often in the form of returning sleepiness, delayed bedtime, reduced sleep quality, or the need for another cup and then another small negotiation with the afternoon. The system is flexible enough to allow these bargains, which is fortunate, because human life would be much duller without tea and much grimmer without coffee. But the deeper rhythm still belongs to sleep. Perhaps the kindest way to understand caffeine is not as a fraud, but as a pause button on one part of fatigue. It buys time. Sometimes that time is wisely used. Sometimes it is squandered on nonsense. Often it is a bit of both, which is only human. But it does not erase the fact that wakefulness has been costly. Adenosine continues to tell the truth in the background, even while some of its words are being politely interrupted by a warm mug and a hopeful expression. And once you understand that small deception, another very ordinary mystery becomes easier to appreciate, because tiredness does not always wait until night to make itself known. Even on fairly normal days, many people feel a soft but undeniable slump arrive in the middle of the afternoon, as though the body has quietly reconsidered its commitment to the project. Part of that dip is about how long you have been awake. Part of it is about your internal clock. And when those two influences briefly line up, sleepiness can step forward in a way that feels far more persuasive than the hour itself seems to justify. It is one of the day's quieter little betrayals. You wake up, begin reasonably well, make your way through the morning with at least some degree of competence, and then somewhere after lunch, or just before it, or at an hour that seems annoyingly early for this sort of thing, the edges begin to soften. Your eyes are not quite heavy in the full evening sense, but they are less enthusiastic than before. Your focus slips. A chair becomes interesting. Reading turns slower. The thought of lying down for 20 minutes begins to sound less like laziness and more like a deeply informed medical recommendation. This is the afternoon dip, one of the most ordinary and misunderstood features of human wakefulness. People often assume this slump must mean they have done something wrong. Perhaps they ate the wrong lunch, slept badly, lacked discipline, or are in some private moral failure known only to office carpets and meeting rooms. Sometimes lunch does matter, and poor sleep certainly matters, But the afternoon dip is not merely a sign of weakness or bad choices. For many people, it is built into the daily pattern of alertness itself. Sleepiness often rises before night comes because two systems are constantly shaping wakefulness at once. One is sleep pressure, which has been building since morning. The other is the circadian rhythm, the internal clock that adjusts alertness across the day and night. When those two begin to line up in a certain way in the afternoon, even briefly, the result can be a very persuasive invitation to stop pretending spreadsheets are exciting. This is why the afternoon dip feels so distinct from full nighttime sleepiness. At night, if all goes reasonably well, the body's internal clock is beginning to support sleep, and adenosine-related sleep pressure has had many hours to accumulate. The message is broad and clear. The body's ready to hand the day over, but in the afternoon the picture is more interesting. Sleep pressure has certainly been rising because you have been awake and metabolically active since morning, yet the circadian system is not normally trying to send you to bed. What often happens instead is a temporary softening in alertness, a small valley in the curve of the day. It is not always dramatic, and not everyone experiences it identically, but it is common enough that cultures all over the world have noticed it long before modern neuroscience arrived with graphs and receptor diagrams. This is one reason the idea of a midday rest appears again and again in human history. In hotter climates, in agricultural societies, in cultures with established periods of rest after lunch, people often arrange the day around the fact that human alertness is not perfectly flat from morning to evening. A short pause in the middle of the day was not always seen as indulgence. Sometimes it was simple wisdom. Work could resume later. The day had its own shape. Modern life, of course, has a somewhat different view. We prefer the fantasy that wakefulness should behave like a straight line, constant, efficient, and available on demand from early morning until bedtime, provided no one turns down the office air conditioning. But the body is less impressed by office expectations than by its own rhythms. The afternoon dip keeps arriving, politely or rudely, depending on circumstances. One of the most important things to understand is that this dip is not caused only by food, though lunch gets blamed with almost touching enthusiasm. People often say they feel sleepy after eating and conclude that the meal itself must be responsible. Certainly, a heavy lunch can increase sluggishness. Blood flow changes, digestion becomes active, and a large meal, especially one rich in simple carbohydrates, can produce a sense of heaviness or reduce sharpness. But many people feel an afternoon dip even without eating much at all. The timing is often too consistent to blame entirely on sandwiches. What is happening is broader than digestion. The brain has been awake for several hours. Adenosine has been accumulating. The internal clock, depending on the hour, is passing through a natural lull in alertness. Add warmth, sitting, repetitive work, poor sleep, a dark room, or a presentation full of bullet points, and the dip becomes very hard to deny. That interaction between sleep pressure and circadian timing is the key. Sleep pressure on its own rises steadily with time awake. That means by afternoon you already have a meaningful amount of it on board, even if you slept well. The circadian rhythm, meanwhile, is not simply a signal for night and morning. It creates fluctuations across the whole day. In many people, especially those on fairly regular schedules, there is a modest drop in alertness during the early to mid-afternoon. This does not usually mean the body is trying to begin full nighttime sleep. It means the push for wakefulness is a little less forceful for a while. When that happens against a background of rising adenosine, the result is that familiar sag in energy and focus. There is something almost comical about how quickly this can change the mood of a room. A group of people in the morning may look capable, organised, faintly optimistic. The same group at 2:30 in the afternoon under warm lights and steady air can look like survivors of a minor but meaningful event. Faces soften, notes become less coherent. Someone stares at a chart as though it may eventually explain itself. Another is fighting a yawn with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for delicate negotiations. The biology is not subtle once you know where to look, yet the dip is not always equally visible because life can temporarily cover it up. Movement helps, bright light helps, Social interaction helps. Novelty helps. Stress, irritatingly, can also help for a time because it raises arousal and makes the brain behave as though something important is happening. This is why you can feel half asleep at your desk, then unexpectedly more awake the moment you stand up, go outside, talk to someone, or panic slightly about a deadline. The afternoon dip did not vanish. It was merely opposed by other signals. In a calmer setting, it often returns. Sit back down in a quiet room after lunch with soft lighting and a task involving passive attention, and biology usually resumes its argument. This is also why driving in the afternoon can be more dangerous than people expect, especially after poor sleep or a heavy meal. The dip in alertness does not feel as dramatic as nighttime fatigue, so it may be underestimated. But a modest reduction in vigilance, especially when combined with monotony and warmth, can be enough to create serious risk. The body does not need to be profoundly sleepy to become less reliably attentive. A small drop in arousal at the wrong time can matter a great deal. It is one of those sober little reminders that wakefulness has quality levels, not merely a yes or no status. Children often show the afternoon dip in wonderfully honest ways. A toddler who is fully committed to civilization at noon may become by 2 o'clock a tiny revolutionary with no coherent platform beyond snack and blanket. School-age children often do better when their schedules acknowledge daily rhythms rather than assuming steady peak performance from dawn onward. Adults, again, are not very different. We're just more likely to call it low energy or a bit of brain fog instead of lying dramatically on the floor. But the underlying truth remains. The body's level of readiness changes across the day, and the afternoon is often one of its softer points. Of course, the size of the dip varies a great deal. Someone who slept badly the night before may feel it like a trapdoor. Someone who slept well, moved during the morning, got daylight early, and eats lightly at lunch may notice only a mild blurring of focus. Chronotype matters too. People whose natural rhythms lean later may experience the afternoon somewhat differently from those who are naturally earlier types. Shift workers may have their own entirely different patterns, especially if their schedules are misaligned with the usual light-dark cycle. Stress changes things, illness changes things, habit changes things, even expectation changes things. If you believe 3 p.m. is when your brain traditionally abandons the project, you may notice that hour with heightened sensitivity. Still, individual variation sits on top of a real physiological pattern. The dip is not a fantasy made up by office workers desperate for better furniture. There is also the matter of temperature, which quietly helps the dip along. Human alertness is influenced by body temperature rhythms across the day. In general, higher body temperature tends to support greater alertness and performance, while lower temperature is associated with sleepiness. The circadian system helps regulate these shifts. In many people, the afternoon includes subtle changes in temperature and arousal that make restful states more plausible. You do not need to consciously detect this for it to matter. Much of the body's timing works beneath awareness. You simply notice the result, which may arrive as slower thought, a longer blink, or the strong conviction that no one has ever needed a cup of tea more than you do right now. And then there is caffeine, of course, the internationally respected method of arguing with the afternoon. Its popularity at this hour makes perfect sense. The dip arrives, the brain loses a little sharpness, and caffeine blocks some of the adenosine signalling that is making the slump feel persuasive. The world brightens again, at least somewhat. Yet as we have already seen, this is a useful trick, not a full solution. The afternoon dip is not imaginary, and caffeine does not erase the day's accumulated sleep pressure. It simply makes the signal easier to ignore for a while. Sometimes that is exactly what a person needs. Sometimes it also means evening sleep is delayed, tomorrow's sleep pressure is less fully relieved, and the next afternoon becomes even more persuasive. The body's patient with these bargains, but it keeps the records. One of the kinder interpretations of the afternoon dip is that it reveals something true about human limits before those limits become severe. It is a modest pause in the story of wakefulness, a reminder that alertness is not a possession but a state maintained by active systems. When those systems soften, even a little, you feel it. And perhaps that is useful. It means you do not have to wait until total exhaustion to know the body would appreciate better care. A slight dip can tell you about last night's sleep, today's demands, your meal timing, your light exposure, your stress level, your hydration, your movement, and the simple fact that your brain has been awake and working since morning. People often respond to this information in one of three ways. They fight it aggressively, which sometimes works and sometimes produces a brittle kind of wakefulness full of sighing. They lean into it with a nap or a quiet break, which can be wonderfully effective when circumstances allow. Or they drift through it with reduced quality, doing what needs doing but with the mental grace of a person trying to fold fitted sheets underwater. None of these responses is a moral category. They are simply different ways of dealing with the daily rhythm. Still, understanding the dip makes it easier to choose wisely. If you know the slump is a real interaction between sleep pressure and circadian timing, it is easier to design around it when possible, rather than interpreting it as an inexplicable personal collapse. Naps are worth mentioning here because they fit the afternoon dip so beautifully. A short nap can lower sleep pressure enough to restore alertness without dragging the body into deeper sleep, from which waking feels unpleasant and confused. Not everyone can nap, and not every schedule allows it, but where it fits, the logic is elegant. The afternoon dip reveals growing pressure. Sleep briefly reduces that pressure. The person wakes with a clearer mind and a more manageable relationship to the rest of the day. This is not laziness dressed as tradition. It is biology being given a small amount of what it was already requesting. Without naps, smaller things can still help. Light exposure, movement, a break from monotonous work, conversation, hydration, and well-timed caffeine can all change the shape of the dip. None abolishes the underlying process entirely, but they can shift how strongly it is felt. This is why people often feel better after walking outside for 10 minutes or standing up and changing tasks. The afternoon slump is real, but it is not immovable. Wakefulness is always a negotiation among multiple forces. A little light emotion can strengthen the wake-promoting side enough to get you through. Still, I think it is useful not to become too hostile toward this part of the day. The afternoon dip is not merely an obstacle. It is information about the shape of human consciousness. It reminds us that the body was never designed to be uniformly sharp from breakfast to bedtime under fluorescent lighting and continuous demand. There are rhythms in us, rise and fall, brightness and softness, focus and its loosening. The dip is one of the day's natural curves, and pretending otherwise mostly leads to unnecessary self-criticism. There is also something almost comforting in the fact that sleepiness can announce itself before night. It means the system is working. The brain is not waiting until the last moment to reveal that wakefulness has been expensive. It gives advance notice, a slowing, a softening, a gentle reduction in the force of outward engagement. The afternoon dip is, in that sense, one of the earliest polite versions of the same message that will later become more insistent at night. You have been awake for a while. The cost is real. The day is not endless. And because the dip is only a partial preview, it can teach you something about what the rest of the cycle will require. A brutal slump may hint at insufficient sleep, accumulated debt, or a rhythm under strain. A mild one may tell you things are broadly in balance. A disappearing dip under constant caffeine may not mean you need less rest, only that the signal has been masked more efficiently. The body is speaking in all these variations. The afternoon is just one of the easier times to hear it. So when that strange softness arrives in the middle of the day, it may help to see it with a little more curiosity. Not as proof that lunch has defeated you, and not as evidence that adulthood has finally exposed your deficiencies, but as a predictable meeting point between time awake and the body's inner clock. Adenosine has been rising. Alertness has shifted. The push to keep going has loosened for a while. Your heavy blink at 2 p.m. is not ridiculous. It is part of the larger pattern by which wakefulness slowly gives way to rest. And that larger pattern, of course, leads somewhere important, because the day cannot keep building sleep pressure forever without some answer arriving. The signal grows. The dip comes and goes. Evening deepens. At some point, the body stops merely hinting and begins asking more clearly for the thing that resolves the pressure itself. Sleep does not only interrupt tiredness, it actively changes the chemistry that created it, lowering adenosine's influence and preparing the brain to begin again when morning returns. By the time sleep finally arrives, adenosine has already done a great deal of its work. It has spent the day building quietly in the background, helping transform hours of wakefulness into that unmistakable feeling that your mind is softening, your focus is loosening, and the whole idea of remaining upright for any noble purpose is beginning to look wildly overrated. But the story does not end when you close your eyes. In some ways, that is when the more interesting half begins, because sleep is not merely what happens after adenosine wins. Sleep is what changes the conditions that made adenosine so persuasive in the first place. This is one of the most important things to understand about rest. Sleep does not just interrupt tiredness the way a pause interrupts music. It actively alters the biology of the tired brain. It lowers sleep pressure. It reduces adenosine's influence. It helps restore the balance that wakefulness has been gradually pushing in the opposite direction since morning. By the time you wake again, assuming the sleep was long enough and reasonably healthy, the signal that once made your eyes heavy and your thoughts slower has been brought back down to a much quieter level. That is why morning can feel so different from late evening. The brain has not simply waited, it has changed state and done work. There is a temptation to think of sleep as nothing more than absence. The lights go off, consciousness fades, and the system stops for maintenance like a shop pulling down its shutters. But sleep is not an empty period. It is full of structure, activity, regulation, and shifting priorities. You're not awake, certainly, and your relationship to the world becomes much thinner. But the brain is still profoundly active in ways that matter. Different sleep stages appear in cycles. Neural activity changes pattern. Hormones move through their own timing. The body alters temperature, muscle tone, and responsiveness. Memory is processed. Various forms of restoration are supported. And among all of this, one of the most important broad changes is that the pressure built during wakefulness begins to come down. That coming down is what makes the phrase reset so helpful, provided we use it sensibly. Sleep is not a magical button that turns a human being into a brand new appliance every morning. It does not erase all consequences of stress, loss, illness, overwork, or poor life choices involving late-night snacks and glowing screens. But it does restore certain systems toward a better baseline, and adenosine is one of the clearest examples of that. The waking day creates a rising push towards sleep. The sleeping night lowers that push. Wakefulness builds pressure. Sleep relieves pressure. It is one of the most basic loops in biology, and it is beautifully practical. Without it, life would quickly become impossible. If wakefulness is the phase in which the brain spends energy openly, then sleep is the phase in which it changes how that expenditure is handled. Adenosine levels and signaling patterns do not remain fixed. They shift as the brain moves into sleep. The specific details vary across brain regions and sleep stages, and neuroscience always becomes wonderfully more detailed the closer you look. But the overall truth is steady. During sleep, especially when sufficient time is spent in deeper and more restorative states, the homeostatic sleep pressure associated with adenosine declines. By morning, if the night has done its work, the brain is less burdened by the accumulated signal of the previous day's wakefulness. That is why a good night of sleep feels so different from simply sitting still in the dark for 8 hours, thinking noble thoughts about rest. The body does not need mere inactivity, it needs sleep. You can lie on a sofa exhausted and motionless, but if you do not sleep, the core chemistry of sleep pressure does not resolve in the same way. You may feel less overstimulated, you may feel physically calmer, but the heavy inner demand for sleep often remains. This is because the system is not asking only for reduced effort. It is asking for a specific biological state in which restoration becomes possible. This makes sleep feel almost like an answer written in the same language as the problem. Adenosine rises because wakefulness is metabolically costly, and prolonged alertness needs a natural limit. Sleep lowers adenosine-related pressure because the brain now has access to the state it has been moving toward all day. The same body that built the need for sleep also contains the means to relieve it, provided it is allowed to do so. There is something deeply satisfying in that symmetry. The day creates its own demands, and the night contains the mechanism for meeting them. One of the reasons this matters so much is that the decline of sleep pressure is not just a theoretical victory for molecules. It changes how thinking feels. If you have ever gone to sleep after being so tired that even simple speech seemed optional, then woken after real rest with your mind noticeably clearer, you already know the difference from the inside. Thoughts return with more precision. Attention can hold. The world feels easier to meet. Annoyances seem smaller. Memory works better. Effort no longer feels outrageously overpriced. That change is not all adenosine, of course. Sleep affects many systems at once. But the reduction of sleep pressure is one of the central reasons morning alertness can exist at all. It is worth noticing that this reduction is gradual through the night, not instantaneous the moment sleep begins. That is another reason why the first hour or two of sleep can feel especially powerful when someone is very tired. The system has been under strong pressure, and now the relief process has begun. Yet a short amount of sleep may not finish the job. A brief nap can help a great deal, but it may only lower the pressure part way. A fragmented night may reduce it somewhat, yet not enough to bring the brain back to a fully refreshed baseline. This is why people can sleep and still wake tired. Sleep happened, but perhaps not enough of it, not deep enough, not regular enough, or not at the right time for the full reset to occur. This is also why sleep debt can feel so stubborn. If several nights in a row fail to reduce sleep pressure adequately, the brain begins each new day with some of yesterday still attached. Then new wakefulness adds more. A full night of decent sleep can help, sometimes dramatically, but recovery after chronic restriction is not always immediate because the system may have spent days being asked to function while under-restored. Adenosine pressure is part of that story, though not the whole of it. The important point is that sleep resets, but reset does not always mean perfection by morning. Biology is patient and cumulative. It responds to patterns, not only to single heroic gestures. There is a quiet lesson in that for anyone who tries to fix a week of poor sleep with one ambitious Sunday morning lie-in and a look of spiritual determination. Extra sleep helps. Recovery sleep matters, but the best reset is usually the one that happens regularly, night after night, when the brain is allowed to move through enough sleep at roughly the times it expects. The body likes rhythm. It likes repeated chances to lower the pressure that wakefulness has built. Adenosine does not care much for motivational speeches. It responds better to actual sleep. When people talk about clearance during sleep, they're often thinking of the idea that the sleeping brain is better able to manage various metabolic byproducts and maintain its internal environment. This is a fascinating area of neuroscience, and while the finer details continue to be studied, the broad message is useful and gentle. Sleep is a time when the brain is not only less outwardly engaged, but differently organized in ways that appear to support internal maintenance. It is not just resting in the casual sense. It is using changed conditions to do different work. The world recedes, and in that quieter state the brain becomes better positioned for forms of housekeeping that constant wakeful engagement does not favour. That word housekeeping may sound less glamorous than the brain deserves, but it is actually rather fitting. A well-lived day leaves traces. Neural activity produces consequences. Metabolism produces byproducts. Attention, perception, movement, memory, emotion. All of these create demands that do not vanish because the clock says midnight. Sleep offers a period in which the brain can rebalance. The reduction in adenosine-related pressure is one part of that broader act of maintenance. It is as though the brain, after spending all day running the front of the house, finally gets a chance to clean the kitchen properly. This is one reason deep sleep has such a good reputation. The stages of sleep are not identical, and each seems to contribute differently to restoration, memory, and brain function. Deep non-REM sleep is especially associated with the dissipation of sleep pressure and the homeostatic recovery that follows sustained wakefulness. When people speak of sleep that feels solid, restorative, and somehow more effective than the same number of hours spent tossing and turning, they are often describing the difference between sleep that truly allows these internal processes to unfold and sleep that is too fragmented to do the job well. A long night broken by repeated interruptions may contain many hours on paper, and yet leave the person feeling as though the reset never really completed. That incomplete reset is familiar to almost everyone. You sleep, technically. You get through the night. But morning still arrives with a kind of sticky heaviness, as though part of the brain has not fully rejoined the enterprise. Coffee seems less optional. Light feels rude. Thought takes time to line up. In those moments, it is very easy to feel that sleep itself has betrayed you. More often, though, the explanation is simpler. The system did not get enough uninterrupted, properly timed or sufficiently deep sleep to lower the pressure as much as it needed to. Sleep happened, but the clearance and reset were partial rather than complete. This also helps explain why waking from a nap can feel either glorious or slightly criminal. A short nap often lowers sleep pressure just enough to produce a refreshing improvement in alertness without dragging the brain too far into deeper stages. A longer nap, especially if it reaches deeper sleep and ends awkwardly, can produce sleep inertia, that groggy, disoriented state in which waking feels less like a return to consciousness and more like being slowly unpacked from wet wool. This is not because naps are bad. It is because the sleeping brain has stages and timing, and waking from some states is smoother than waking from others. Even here, though, the basic principle holds. Sleep is changing the pressure. The difference lies in how much and from where you're pulled back. One of the loveliest things about sleep, when it works well, is how little you have to do to receive its benefits. You do not have to consciously lower adenosine. You do not have to manage receptor occupancy with a clipboard. You do not have to supervise your own neural maintenance with tiny lamps and a respectable cardigan. You lie down. If fortune and routine permit, you drift, and the body begins doing what it has spent the day preparing to do. That is one of the great kindnesses of biology. So much of what keeps us alive and functional happens below the level of instruction. We are not required to understand the chemistry in order to benefit from it. Of course, modern life is endlessly inventive in finding ways to interfere. Bright light late at night can delay the natural timing that supports sleep onset. Stress can keep the mind alert long after the body is tired. Alcohol may make a person feel sleepy at first, while damaging the quality and structure of later sleep. Irregular schedules can confuse the relationship between sleep pressure and circadian timing. Noise, discomfort, pain, temperature, screens, illness, late caffeine, and the general habit of telling yourself you will just check one thing before bed can all disrupt the reset your brain was hoping for. None of these abolishes the underlying logic, but they can make the descent rougher and the restoration thinner. This is why the idea of sleep hygiene, for all its faintly judgmental name, has such sensible roots. The brain resets best when sleep is given decent conditions in which to happen. Darkness helps, regular timing helps, reduced stimulation helps, a cool room helps, a quiet environment helps. Not because the brain is delicate in some spoiled or theatrical way, but because sleep is an active physiological state that benefits from being protected rather than casually sabotaged. If adenosine has spent the day making the case for rest, it seems only fair to stop cross-examining the witness at midnight under blue light. There is also something emotionally important in understanding that rest is not laziness, but resolution. When you finally sleep, you are not abandoning the day in defeat. You are allowing the processes that the day itself created to be addressed properly. The reduction of adenosine-related sleep pressure is one clear example of that. The body asked for sleep because the body needed sleep. Then, during sleep, the need begins to be answered. Seen that way, bedtime stops looking like surrender and starts looking more like completion. The system is closing a loop. That loop becomes especially visible on mornings after genuinely good sleep. You wake before the alarm, or at least without wanting to file a complaint against the existence of time. The room looks ordinary instead of hostile. Thoughts rise more easily. Decisions do not feel expensive. The emotional weather is steadier. Even the body carries itself differently, less as a reluctant vehicle and more as a workable arrangement. This is not because sleep has turned you into a superior being. It is because several important pressures have been lowered, and one of them is the pressure that adenosine helped build all day yesterday. It is worth being honest, though, that not every morning offers this clean feeling. Some people live with sleep disorders, pain, young children, shift work, anxiety, hormones in revolt, environmental disruption, or life circumstances that make restorative sleep far harder to come by. For them, the principle remains true even when the experience is less generous. The body still tries to reset, sleep still matters, adenosine-related pressure still lowers during rest. But the night may not be long enough, deep enough, or protected enough for the person to feel the full benefit. That is not personal failure. It is what happens when a sensible system is asked to work under unsensible conditions. And yet even partial sleep is often better than none. The system does not demand perfection in order to function. It simply works better the more consistently it is allowed to complete its task. A short rest may reduce some pressure. A decent night may reduce much more. A run of better sleep can transform how clearly a person feels the difference between being fundamentally rested and merely held together by ritual and hot beverages. Once you know what true reset feels like, it becomes harder to romanticize exhaustion. Perhaps that is the quiet wisdom hidden in adenosine's whole story. The waking day builds a need you cannot permanently charm, outperform, or negotiate away. Then sleep, when it finally comes, does not just hide that need, it answers it. The chemistry shifts, the pressure falls, the brain becomes less burdened by the signal that had been dimming thought and thickening the edges of the world. In the morning, you begin again not because last night was empty, but because it was full of the work required to make beginning again possible. So when rest finally wins, something real is resolved. Adenosine no longer presses with the same weight. The accounting of wakefulness has been partly cleared, the system has been rebalanced. Sleep has not erased every difficulty in life, but it has changed one of the most fundamental conditions of being awake. It has lowered the pressure that makes continued wakefulness feel costly, and helped return the brain to a state where alertness can once again feel natural rather than forced. And once you see that, the next difficulty becomes easier to understand, because the reset only works well when the larger system is allowed to stay in rhythm. If stress, late nights, bright screens, irregular schedules, or chronic sleep loss keep interrupting the cycle, adenosine's message starts arriving in a body that never quite gets to finish listening properly. Then tiredness becomes more tangled, mornings become less clean, and the natural conversation between wakefulness and sleep begins to sound more like two people trying to speak over each other in a brightly lit room. For all its elegance, the sleep system is not especially difficult to disrupt. It is sturdy in some ways, wonderfully adaptive in others, but it is not invincible. It depends on timing, repetition, cues, and a certain amount of cooperation from the life surrounding it. And modern life, for all its conveniences, is remarkably gifted at withholding that cooperation. Stress runs late, screens glow, messages arrive, work spills past its borders, entertainment stretches into the hours once reserved for winding down. The body asks for rhythm, and the world replies with notifications. So when the system gets thrown off, it is usually not because the brain has forgotten how to sleep. It is because the quiet conversation between wakefulness and rest is being interrupted from several directions at once. What makes this especially frustrating is that the pressure for sleep can still be there the entire time. Adenosine may be rising normally. The body may be tired in a deep and genuine sense. Heavy eyes may arrive. Focus may fray. Yet the final handover into sleep becomes delayed, shortened, fragmented, or poor in quality. This is one of the odd miseries of modern fatigue. People are not always failing to become tired. Very often they are tired at exactly the right time, but the conditions around them are preventing that tiredness from turning cleanly into restorative sleep. The signal is not missing. It is being overruled, postponed, confused, or repeatedly interrupted. Stress is one of the most common ways this happens. In principle, the sleep system is built around the idea that wakefulness gradually gives way to rest, as sleep pressure rises and circadian timing supports the transition. Stress, however, can throw a great deal of sand into those gears. A stressed brain does not behave like a calm one that happens to be tired. It behaves like a brain that believes something still requires vigilance. Even if the body is exhausted, stress can keep the system partly on guard. Thoughts loop, muscles remain slightly braced. The heart may be faster than ideal. The mind keeps returning to the same worries as though repetition itself might somehow solve them. In that state, adenosine may be saying you need sleep, while stress is saying, now would be an excellent time to imagine every possible problem in vivid detail. That mismatch is exhausting in a particular way because it creates the sensation of being tired and wired at the same time. The body wants to stop, the mind keeps pacing. Sleep pressure is present, but arousal is also present. One signal is inviting surrender, while another is insisting on preparedness. Anyone who has lain in bed feeling perfectly sleepy in the abstract, but completely unable to let go in practice, knows this feeling intimately. It can make the person doubt their own body, as though tiredness was somehow fake because sleep is not arriving. But the tiredness is usually real. The problem is that the system has been asked to hold two incompatible positions at once. Stress does not have to be dramatic to do this. It need not be a crisis, a disaster, or a grand existential emergency. Ordinary ongoing stress is often enough. Financial pressure, unresolved conflict, a difficult workload, uncertainty about the future, family strain, health worries, social tension, or the accumulated hum of too many responsibilities can all keep the nervous system slightly elevated. Modern stress is frequently not a tiger leaping from a bush. It is an inbox, a bill, a message not answered, a body not fully well, a mind that has learned to keep scanning. The brain may know, in theory, that bedtime has arrived, but another part of the system has not received the update. Late nights complicate the picture in a different way. They do not always begin as acts of rebellion. Sometimes they happen because life spills over, work runs long, children wake, travel interferes. A task takes more time than expected. A person gets home late and wants one quiet hour that feels like their own. Sometimes, too, late nights are chosen because sleep itself has begun to feel like a sacrifice rather than a relief. If the day belonged to everyone else, staying up can feel like reclaiming something, even if what is reclaimed is mostly poor lighting and regrettable scrolling. People call this revenge bedtime procrastination now, which is a modern phrase for a very old human impulse. If the day did not contain enough ease, the night begins to feel too precious to surrender. The difficulty is that the sleep system is not moved by the emotional logic of this arrangement. Stay awake later, and sleep pressure does continue to rise, certainly, but the circadian timing that supports good sleep can also be shifted or strained, especially if late nights become habitual. The later a person stays awake, particularly in bright light and high stimulation, the more likely they are to push the natural boundaries of the body's preferred rhythm. Then morning arrives at its appointed time anyway, as mornings so often do, and sleep becomes shorter than needed. The next day begins with incomplete reset. Adenosine pressure starts from a higher baseline. The afternoon dip hits harder. Caffeine becomes more attractive. Stress becomes more difficult to regulate. And by evening the person is tired, but perhaps too stimulated, resentful, or off rhythm to fall asleep easily. One late night becomes two, then several, and the body begins living in a pattern of partial recovery. Screens deserve their terrible reputation here, though not because they are evil objects radiating moral decline from the bedside table. They are simply very good at doing several unhelpful things at once. First, they emit light, especially blue-rich light, which can influence the circadian system by making the brain less certain that night has really arrived. Light is one of the strongest cues the body uses to time sleep and alertness. Bright evening light, especially close to the eyes and used repeatedly at night, can delay the release of signals that support sleep readiness. In plain terms, your brain is more likely to stay in perhaps still daytime mode when a glowing rectangle is shining into it at 11:30. Second, screens are rarely just light. They are also stimulation. Messages, videos, news, games, social feeds, email, articles, shopping, arguments, clips. One more episode, one more scroll, one more thing. The content itself matters. A calm screen showing a dull weather map is not the same thing as a screen serving up outrage, novelty, emotional activation, or endless little rewards calibrated to keep attention from loosening. Sleep requires disengagement. Screens are often designed to prevent it. The result is that the very tiredness adenosine has helped build can be repeatedly interrupted by small bursts of mental involvement. The person becomes too sleepy to think clearly and yet too stimulated to drift cleanly into sleep. It is not an ideal arrangement. There is also the problem of fragmentation. Stolen sleep is not always sleep that never happens. Sometimes it is sleep that happens in poor pieces. A person falls asleep late, wakes often, returns to sleep, rises early, and then wonders why 8 hours in bed did not feel like restoration. But time in bed is not the same as uninterrupted, high-quality sleep moving through its stages with enough continuity to do what the brain needs. Stress, noise, light, alcohol, temperature, pain, anxiety, a partner's snoring, children, pets with suspiciously strong opinions about dawn, or a phone buzzing at intervals can all break the night into fragments. Each interruption may seem small, yet the overall effect can be substantial. Sleep pressure is lowered somewhat, yes, but not with the same grace or depth as during a protected night. Morning arrives with the system technically having slept, but not truly reset. That phrase, stolen sleep, is useful because it captures how loss often happens now. Sleep is not always dramatically refused. It is shaved away. 10 minutes here, half an hour there, a late show, a few messages, a task that runs over, an alarm set earlier than necessary, just in case, a child waking, a delayed bedtime after scrolling, a too late coffee, a mind that cannot let go. Little thefts accumulate. The person is not always aware of how much has been taken, because each single piece feels manageable. But the body keeps count in a way culture often does not. It notices the missing restoration. It notices the incomplete reduction of sleep pressure. It notices when wakefulness keeps beginning before the prior day's cost has fully been paid. And then, because biology has a dry sense of humour, the consequences of this stolen sleep often make the next night harder too. A poorly rested person may use more caffeine, feel more stressed, exercise less, snack later, crave more stimulation, struggle to regulate mood, and find it harder to create the calm conditions that would support good sleep. The very state created by sleep loss can encourage behaviours that perpetuate it. None of this is a moral failing. It is simply what happens when a tired brain starts making choices inside a system already under strain. Artificial schedules add another layer. Human biology evolved under a world of sunrise, sunset, and more locally grounded patterns of activity. It can adapt, and that adaptability is part of what makes modern civilization possible, but the costs are not evenly distributed. Early alarms cut across natural sleep timing for many people, especially those whose chronotype leans later. Shift work asks the body to sleep and wake at times that may conflict strongly with its circadian preferences. Travel throws light exposure and timing into confusion. Social obligations run into the evening. Work may begin too early or end too late. The result is that many people live in a permanent tug-of-war between what the body would choose and what life requires. Adenosine still rises, sleep pressure still builds. But the opportunity to resolve it cleanly may arrive at the wrong time or not last long enough. This is one reason a person can feel exhausted and yet strangely unable to sleep when given the chance. If the circadian rhythm has been shifted, if stress is elevated, if light exposure has delayed the internal night, or if the person has been sleeping at wildly inconsistent hours, then the signal from sleep pressure may not line up neatly with the timing systems that help sleep happen. The body may be sincerely tired, yet sleep on set becomes awkward. It is not that the person no longer needs sleep, it is that the coordination between need and timing has been disrupted. Alcohol is another notorious meddler in this story. It is often mistaken for a sleep aid because it can make people feel drowsy and help them fall asleep more quickly, at least at first. But drowsiness is not the same as healthy sleep. Alcohol can fragment the later part of the night, alter sleep architecture, worsen snoring or breathing problems, and generally reduce the quality of the sleep that follows. So a person may feel that a drink helps them switch off, while in reality the overall reset becomes thinner and less complete. Again, the theme repeats. Something may appear to solve the difficulty of sleep while actually interfering with what sleep is meant to accomplish. Even light itself, innocent as it seems, becomes a major player in a system thrown off course. Morning light helps anchor the circadian rhythm and reinforce the timing of alertness and later sleepiness. Evening light, especially bright and close, can delay that process. Yet many people begin their day indoors under dim conditions and end it under artificial brightness. The body receives weak signals when it most needs strong ones and strong signals when it would benefit from darkness. That confusion may not prevent sleep entirely, but it can make the rhythm less stable, less predictable, less supportive of the clean cycle in which adenosine rises by day and is fully relieved at night. There is also a quiet emotional cost to all this that is easy to overlook. When the sleep system gets thrown off repeatedly, people often begin to distrust their own tiredness. They feel sleepy at inconvenient times, awake at miserable ones, and inconsistent in their energy from day to day. They may start trying to control sleep too directly, watching the clock, worrying about whether sleep is coming, calculating how bad tomorrow will be if it does not. Sleep, which depends partly on letting go, begins to feel like a performance that must be forced. That rarely helps. Anxiety about sleep becomes one more layer of arousal over a system already struggling to settle. And yet, for all this fragility, the sleep system is also remarkably forgiving when given a fair chance. It can recover from a disrupted night. It can respond to better timing, morning light, regular routines, reduced evening stimulation, less late caffeine, calmer pre-sleep habits, and protected time in bed. It does not demand perfection. It asks mainly for consistency and conditions it can work with. The problem is that the modern world keeps asking the opposite. Stay up, be available, remain stimulated, work late, rest later, sleep when convenient, and then, when the body objects, act surprised. Perhaps the kindest way to think about a thrown-off system is not as a broken body, but as a sensible body living under unsensible circumstances. Stress is loud, screens are bright, schedules are often unnatural, sleep is repeatedly stolen in small pieces. Adenosine continues doing its patient work, but its message arrives in a brain surrounded by contradiction. One part of the system says sleep, another says keep going. One says darkness, another says just one more episode. One says release the day, Another says answer that message, worry about tomorrow, read the news, check the time, feel guilty, start over. That is why mornings in such a state can feel oddly grim even after technically enough hours have passed. The system never got its full turn. The reduction of sleep pressure was incomplete. The emotional tone may still be unsettled. Attention may not fully return. The day begins with residue instead of clarity. And then a new day of wakefulness begins adding to what was never fully cleared. Over time, this can make tiredness feel like a personality trait rather than a signal. But it is still a signal. It is still telling the truth about what the brain has not been allowed to complete. The good news, if one can call it that, is that biology does not require dramatic reinvention to improve. Often the system responds to simple, boring things with almost embarrassing gratitude. A more regular bedtime, a more regular wake time, morning daylight, dimmer evenings, less caffeine too late, fewer glowing interruptions, a quieter winding down, a room that is cooler and darker, not perfection, just less sabotage. The sleep system is not asking for a moonlit ritual and imported lavender on a silver tray. It is asking for a decent chance to do what it was built to do, so when the system gets thrown off, it is rarely because the body has become impossible. It is because the environment and habits around the body have become too loud, too bright, too irregular, too demanding, or too emotionally activated for the handover into restorative sleep to occur cleanly. Adenosine continues building pressure, but pressure alone is not enough. Sleep also needs timing, safety, darkness, and the reduction of needless stimulation. Without those things, the signal arrives and the body feels tired, but the reset remains partial, delayed, or stolen in pieces. And perhaps that is what makes the final part of this whole story feel gentler than the rest. Because after all the molecules, receptors, pressure, timing, disruption, and noise, the body is still doing something deeply ordinary and deeply kind. It is trying to guide you home to rest. Adenosine has spent the day marking the cost of wakefulness. The system has tried, even under interruption, to move you towards sleep. And if you listen closely at the end of it all, the message is not scolding. It is simple. You have been awake. You have done enough for now. And somewhere beneath the bright world and its bad habits, a tiny molecule has been helping lead you here all along. By now, adenosine may feel a little less like an obscure word from a textbook, and a little more like a familiar presence that has been quietly walking beside you all day. Not loudly, not dramatically, certainly not with a brass band or a warning siren. Just steadily, patiently, almost politely, doing the sort of work that biology does best when it is not asking for applause. It has been there in the morning when wakefulness first took hold, there in the afternoon when attention softened at the edges, there in the evening when the furniture began looking unusually persuasive, and there tonight, at the end of this long, gentle journey, helping explain why the mind eventually stops wanting so much from the world. There is something comforting in that, I think. Tiredness can feel so vague when we live inside it. It can feel like failure, or weakness, or inconvenience, or proof that we are somehow not built for the pace of the life around us. And yet underneath all of that interpretation is a much simpler truth. You get tired because your brain has been working. You get sleepy because wakefulness costs something. You need sleep not because you have done life badly, but because you have done life at all. Adenosine, in its quiet molecular way, has been keeping count of that cost, translating the invisible labour of staying conscious into a signal you can actually feel. That signal, for all its inconvenience, is one of the body's kinder acts. It would be easy to imagine a less graceful design, a brain that remained alert until it simply broke down, a body that failed without warning, a mind that had no gentle slope between sharpness and collapse. But that is not what happened. Instead, the system gives hints. It softens things gradually, focus loosens a little, effort becomes more expensive, emotions become less elegantly managed. The world itself does not change, but but your relationship to it begins to shift. By the time sleep starts to seem less like an option and more like the sensible conclusion to the day, the body has been trying to tell you for hours that it would like a turn at a different kind of work. And that may be the nicest part of this whole story. Sleep is not just what happens when adenosine has won some tiny molecular contest. Sleep is not a defeat. It is not the body giving up. It is the answer to a need the body has been building carefully all day long. Wakefulness creates pressure. Sleep relieves it. Activity leaves traces. Rest helps clear them. Energy is spent in the business of being alive, and then the night arrives so that some of what was spent can be restored. The cycle is not glamorous, but it is wonderfully sane. The body does not demand endlessness from itself. It insists on rhythm. For many people, that insistence is easy to forget. Modern life is very clever at making natural signals seem negotiable. There is always one more message, one more thing to finish, one more episode, one more reason to stay awake just a little longer. Light no longer fades on its own. Work no longer lives only in one building or one part of the day. Entertainment arrives endlessly. Anxiety finds fresh material on command. It is possible now to remain mentally lit far beyond the hour when the body would have preferred to dim the room from within. In a world like that, adenosine can begin to feel less like a guide and more like a nuisance, because it keeps insisting on a truth the culture would rather not hear. You are finite. You have limits. Wakefulness is not free. But finitude is not bad news. Limits are not insults. In a strange way, they are part of what makes life feel shaped rather than endless and flat. The day has a beginning because waking begins it. It has a middle because attention, work, movement, meals, thoughts and effort fill it. And it has an end because the body knows how to stop. Adenosine is part of that stopping. It helps turn the world down little by little, not because the world has become unimportant, but because the brain has been engaged with it for long enough. There is dignity in that stop. There is wisdom in a system that knows the value of lowering its own lights. This is also why real rest feels so different from simply doing less. There are evenings when a person sits still for hours and yet does not feel restored. The body may be quieter, but the mind remains half held by stimulation, worry, brightness, or unfinished thought. Then there are nights when sleep truly takes hold, and morning arrives with a quality of clarity that almost feels like forgiveness. Thoughts line up more readily. Attention obeys. Small frustrations seem smaller. The body feels like a place you can live in again rather than merely drag around. That shift does not happen because the hours passed. It happens because sleep actually changed something. Adenosine's influence was reduced. Sleep pressure was lowered. The brain got to do the work it had been requesting all along. It is worth dwelling on that because people are often much harsher with themselves than biology ever is. A person feels tired and calls themselves lazy. They struggle to focus and call themselves undisciplined. They need more sleep than they think they should, and begin measuring themselves against the fictional adult who somehow wakes before dawn, performs brilliantly, drinks water cheerfully, and never becomes sentimental in the lighting aisle of a supermarket because they are under-rested. But the body does not make these judgments. Adenosine does not rise with disappointment in its molecular voice. It rises because you have been awake. It rises because neurons have been active, because energy has been used, because the mind and body have been doing what minds and bodies do. The signal is not a criticism, it is a record. That record grows richer the more gently you notice it. You may begin to see the afternoon dip not as personal collapse, but as timing. You may notice that caffeine does not truly remove tiredness, only interrupts part of its message. You may find that stress can keep the body tired while making the mind too alert to settle. You may recognize that some evenings are difficult not because sleep has abandoned you, but because light, habit, worry or stimulation have crowded the doorway through which sleep was trying to enter. None of this makes human rest easy all the time. Life remains wonderfully capable of making nonsense of simple, biological preferences. But understanding the system changes the texture of the struggle. It replaces mystery with pattern. It replaces shame with structure. And perhaps structure is one of the most soothing things science can offer. Not certainty about every detail, because biology is too alive and too intricate for that, but the reassurance that ordinary experience has meaning. Heavy eyes mean something. The soft fading of concentration means something. The way a day can begin bright and end thick-edged means something. Even the miserable state of being tired and yet not quite able to sleep means something. These are not random betrayals. They are signs of systems interacting, sometimes gracefully, sometimes awkwardly, but always with reasons behind them. Adenosine is only one piece of that larger picture, but it is a lovely piece because it sits so close to experience. You cannot feel molecules directly, and yet in this case you almost can. Their work rises all the way into consciousness as drowsiness, slowing, softness, the quiet request to stop. There is a sort of humility in that request that feels especially right before sleep. The world during the day asks for many things. It asks for performance, response, speed, interpretation, memory, planning, self-control, emotional steadiness, social grace, judgment, and effort. It asks for screens and speech and movement and decisions and the management of dozens of tiny practical problems that together make up an ordinary life. By evening, the body has had enough of those demands, not in anger, not in protest, simply in fact. Adenosine has been helping turn that fact into feeling, so that even if you ignore the early whispers, you may still hear the later ones. Enough for now, not forever, just for now. That phrase matters. So much of good biology is temporary. Hunger asks to be answered, then settles. Sleep pressure rises, then falls. Stress can surge, then recede. Pain warns, then quiets. Fatigue deepens, then lifts with proper rest. The body is not frozen in any one state for long. It is dynamic, adjusting constantly, changing its chemistry as your life changes around it. That is why even miserable tiredness can contain a strange comfort. It implies the possibility of change. You are not doomed to remain exactly this way. The system moves. The pressure can come down. Morning can feel different. Sleep, when it's allowed to do its work, is one of the great agents of that difference. Of course, not every person gets easy access to that difference. Some live with insomnia, pain, shift work, anxiety, illness, caregiving, noise, or schedules that do not make friends with circadian rhythm. Some lie down genuinely tired and find that the body has arrived at the edge of sleep only for the mind to start rehearsing every awkward thing it has ever done since approximately age 9. Some sleep long and wake unrefreshed. Some still sleep in little pieces because life keeps taking from the night. None of this changes the beauty of the system, but it does remind us that beauty and ease are not always the same thing. The body may know what it needs and still struggle to receive it under human conditions. That is not failure. It is what happens when a sensible system is asked to function in a noisy world. Yet even there, the message remains gentle. Adenosine keeps telling the truth. The day was costly. Rest matters. Sleep is not decorative. Whatever else is complicating the process, the underlying need remains valid. There is something almost steadying about that. Beneath all the chaos of schedule and stress and technology and emotion, the body still knows the basic shape of things: wake, work, grow tired, sleep, restore, begin again. The details become wildly complex, yes. Human life always adds embroidery, but the pattern underneath is very old and very calm. Perhaps that is why the subject feels so fitting for a quiet evening reflection. Adenosine is not a dramatic molecule. It is not flashy. It does not get the glamorous treatment that some brain chemicals receive. No one writes novels about how their evening was transformed by an intimate new appreciation for adenosine receptor dynamics, though perhaps they should. And yet it has been quietly shaping the rhythm of every day you have ever lived. It has been part of the reason your childhood eyelids drooped in the backseat of the car. part of the reason all-nighters feel less heroic at 4 in the morning than they do at 10 the previous evening, part of the reason long afternoons soften, and why late-night confidence in ambitious life choices should often be treated with suspicion. It has helped bring you to bedsides, sofas, train windows, desk yawns, early alarms, naps, and the final surrender of attention at the end of a long day. And now, having followed it through wakefulness, through sleep pressure, through caffeine's interruptions, through circadian dips and stolen sleep and the night's quiet reset, we arrive at a rather simple thought. The body has been trying to care for you this whole time, not perfectly, not elegantly every day, not without frustration, but sincerely. Tiredness is part of that care. The need to stop is part of that care. Even the lowering of thought and focus is part of that care, because it makes rest possible when the conscious mind might otherwise insist on continuing indefinitely for reasons that would sound much less convincing in the morning. So if you happen to be feeling sleepy now, if your eyes are slower than they were when these words began, if your thoughts have become softer around the edges, that does not mean anything has gone wrong. It may simply mean the system has been doing exactly what it was built to do. A day was lived, energy was used, attention was spent, adenosine kept watch, and now the body is leaning quite reasonably toward the state that answers all of that with restoration. There is no need to force poetry onto it. The truth is plain enough already. You are tired because you are alive in a body that keeps honest accounts. You need sleep because wakefulness leaves marks. You drift because chemistry and rhythm and habit and history all meet in the same gentle slope toward rest. And somewhere in that slope, one small molecule has been helping to guide you, not with cruelty, but with patience. So let the day be enough. Let the unfinished things wait in their unfinished way. Let the questions loosen. Let the bright world dim a little. The brain knows this road better than it sometimes seems to. Adenosine has been marking the distance hour by hour, and now at last the body may begin the quieter work it has been asking for. Somewhere beneath thought, beneath effort, beneath the long conversation between wakefulness and sleep, the system is still moving in its old reliable rhythm, and tonight, as on so many nights before, that tiny molecule has helped lead you gently to the edge of rest.